Chapter 199. At this moment, everyone's eyes were focused on Li Tianlan. The venue was quiet, but in the silence, there seemed to be a storm brewing and becoming turbulent. The lights above were getting brighter and brighter. A huge crystal chandelier was placed in the center of the ceiling. Around the chandelier, the ceiling was also covered with circles of small lights. When all the lights were on, the whole venue was full of light, without a trace of darkness. Faces of anger, coldness, excitement, jealousy, mockery, or hatred were clearly reflected under the lights of the venue, like the hundreds of expressions of all living beings. No one would question the strength of Sai City. They had the absolute strength to have a place in the center of the venue. But when Sai City and the descendant of the Li family came together, the emotions that emerged in most people's hearts were suspicion and hatred. Nearly 20 years had washed away the glory of the Li family, but the grievances and even hatred left at the beginning were still clear. For the special warfare system of Jianghu state, at least for a considerable number of people in the special warfare system, they could accept a young heavenly son with wind and thunder veins, but they could not accept a peerless genius with the inheritance of the Li family. It had nothing to do with position or hatred, but the overall situation. The name, Li Tianlan, now meant too many things. If it was expressed in the simplest words, it would be turbulence, change, and chaos. But the overall situation of Jianghu state was stable. The venue became silent and then cold. It was bitterly cold. In silence, Li Tianlan had already sat down in the center, waiting quietly. Countless eyes were intertwined and gathered on him. Li Tianlan was expressionless and faced it calmly. He was facing it, not bearing it. At this moment, no one knew how strong Li Tianlan's heart was, and how fragile it was. He would rather face the entire world than bear even a tiny bit of it. He didn't want to, and he didn't dare to. Isn't this too ostentatious? In the center of the venue, Li Beitian frowned slightly and said to himself, sitting in a seat slightly behind Li Tianlan. The seats in the venue were round, and Li Beitian sat right opposite Li Tianlan. Looking at Li Tianlan's face, Li Beitian frowned. With his status, he really needs to show off for once. Next to Li Beitian, a middle-aged man who looked to be in his 40s smiled and said. The middle-aged man was a bit shorter than Li Beitian, so he wasn't very tall. However, his smiling face could be said to be elegant and extraordinarily handsome. The man wore a moon-white robe, and his hair was also as white as snow, so white that there wasn't a single impurity in it. White clothes, white hair, a face like jade. The man's every move was extremely restrained, without the slightest sword intent, but his entire person was like a famous sword that had been sheathed. Although he didn't reveal his edge, he had a kind of reserved and arrogant feeling. A simple and unadorned broad-edged long sword that was black and white was placed next to his hand. With the man and the sword matching each other, the middle-aged man's every word and action were full of confidence and elegance. The Yin-Yang swordmaster of Mount Shu, Han Chongyang. He was one of the strongest thunder-shocking realm experts in Jianghu state. He did not enter the list of the top 10 contemporary experts in Jianghu state, but what he lacked was not strength but prestige. Third senior brother seems to know something? Li Beitian looked at Han Chongyang in surprise. Nearly 30 swordsmen from Mount Shu entered Chongdao this time, and less than 10 people entered the venue. But only Li Beitian could sit side by side with Han Chongyang. What can I know? Han Chongyang's smile remained unchanged, but his eyes became deeper and deeper. As the light flowed, he hid all his emotions. Shit, something is wrong no matter how I think about it. In front of his senior brother, Li Beitian had always been unscrupulous, to the extent that he had no taboo. What's going on? I thought Tianlan would come with the people from Samsara. Why is he with the people from Sai City? It's not that the people from Sai City are bad, but Tianlan and Goddess Qin were like glue not long ago. Why did he suddenly turn against them? Turn against them? Han Chongyang raised his eyebrows and chuckled in a low voice. What were you looking at just now? If they really turned against each other, would Li Tianlan dare to walk so close to Duke? At that distance, if Duke wanted to take action, no matter how talented Li Tianlan was, even if tribulation was by his side, he would definitely die. And who was Duke? He was the 4th supermaster of Samsara. If they really turned against each other, would he voluntarily make way for Li Tianlan? Boy, don't look at everything on the surface. Li Beitian was stunned. He didn't speak for a long time. He tried to recall the moment when Li Tianlan passed by the 3 supermasters of samsara. After a long time he said softly, "Third senior brother, are you saying that Tianlan and samsara are acting? They did it on purpose?" Samsara must have done it on purpose. Maybe Li Tianlan has noticed something? Noticed what? How do I know? You must know. I won't tell you even if I know. What? Li Baitian's face turned red. After a long time, he took a breath and shook his head. It's still not right. Isn't his acting too clumsy? Third senior brother, can't so many people in the venue see what you can see? How is that reasonable? You have to see what they are looking at. Han Chongyang said slowly, it also depends on what samsara is acting. You said yourself that Li Tianlan and the woman of samsara are very close. I heard that in the dark world, she is like a goddess. Given their relationship, who can believe that they will break up completely? Samsara doesn't expect others to believe it. The woman of samsara wants to give Li Tianlan an identity that has nothing to do with samsara. But this identity must be strong enough, and Sai City is the best choice. What's the point? Li Baitian was still puzzled. The point? Han Chongyang said with a faint smile. Of course it's meaningful. At least now Li Tianlan is a member of Sai City, and samsara has at least made a move to draw a clear line with Li Tianlan on the surface. At this time, whoever says that Li Tianlan has something to do with samsara will offend Sai City first. But that's only on the surface? Li Baitian looked at Han Chongyang. Han Chongyang nodded. His white hair rose gently, and there seemed to be sword intent dancing in his hair. On the surface that's enough, he said slowly. This time, Li Baitian didn't ask whether it was meaningful or not. Instead, he looked thoughtful. In his mind, samsara's inexplicable change was too abrupt. When the will of the master of Samsara Palace was silent, Qin Weibai was the will of Samsara Palace. There was no doubt about that. But at the very beginning, Qin Weibai was almost wild and unrestrained to get closer to Li Tianlan, and she even offered herself to Li Tianlan. How long had it been? Why did Qin Weibai want to draw a clear line with Li Tianlan? And she didn't really draw a clear line. What did she want to do? This change seemed to be around the time when Jianghu State plotted against East Island. But Samsara and Jianghu State cooperated to plot against East Island. No. Cooperation? Li Baitian suddenly looked up at Han Chongyang. His back was soaked in cold sweat almost instantly, and it even flowed down along his forehead. So far, Jianghu State and Samsara had indeed cooperated happily. But were they really cooperating? If Samsara really wanted to cooperate, why did she want to draw a clear line with Li Tianlan at this time? Samsara? Li Baitian opened his mouth and suddenly found his tone so weak. Third senior brother, samsara is disloyal, isn't it? They have their standpoint. Han Chongyang's tone was calm. Standpoint, standpoint. Li Baitian's mind was complicated, and he didn't even know how he felt in his heart. This plot of Jianghu State is a conspiracy. It's a conspiracy from all sides, and no one knows who will succeed until the end. Hey, third senior brother, if samsara is disloyal, what will happen to Jianghu State? What's the standpoint of our Mount Shu? Han Chongyang turned his head very slowly and looked at Li Baitian with no expression on his face. Li Baitian's face gradually turned pale. Nearly 3,000 people, including Northern Europe, North America. Is it? Jianghu State will win. Han Chongyang suddenly said in a firm and erratic tone, I don't have to help samsara. I don't have that obligation, right? Li Baitian believed this 100%, but in his heart, it was only half a sentence. If you don't help samsara, what about Jianghu State? He suddenly asked. In his sight, Han Chongyang had turned his head. Li Baitian could only see Han Chongyang's cold side face and a long silence. He looked at Han Chongyang and then at Li Tianlan, but he suddenly thought of samsara. At this moment, Li Baitian felt crazy. Extreme crazy. Why are you sitting here? Perhaps it was because the silence in the venue had been too long, so when a voice that was not deliberately lowered suddenly sounded, it sounded particularly clear. This question was calm and indifferent, but there seemed to be a kind of extremely heavy power between the lines. The voice sounded right beside him. Li Tianlan slightly raised his eyebrows and casually turned his head. The gaze beside him fell straight on his face. It was calm and indifferent, without anger or hatred, but with a little doubt. The other party seemed to really wonder why Li Tianlan could sit here, and he had no other thoughts. This kind of gaze was undoubtedly the most hurtful. Gu Hanzhan, the young master of Kunlun City. Everyone's spirits were lifted. It was as if the show they had been looking forward to for a long time had finally begun. The descendant of the Li family made a high-profile appearance on such an occasion. It was of extraordinary significance to the entire special warfare system of Jianghu state. Others might be dissatisfied or hostile, but they could bear it. At least they would not show up on such an occasion. But Kunlun City was different. Not to mention the inside story of Li Guangtu's treason, it was an indisputable fact that Gu Xingyun's rise and eventual overthrow of the Li family. When the Li family reappeared, everyone could remain silent, but Kunlun City could not. The silence of others could be regarded as wait and see. Once Kunlun City was silent, it might mean retreat and a guilty conscience in the eyes of others. Li Tianlan's appearance was undoubtedly the most variable that could affect Kunlun City's status today. He was the most direct threat, and once he grew up, he could even be said to be the most deadly threat. Mortal enemy. Such a relationship could not be concealed even if they wanted to. Kunlun City had to speak today. No matter whether their words were useful or not, they had to express their attitude at least. Who are you? Li Tianlan's expression did not change, and he asked indifferently. His expression and tone were also sincere. Except for doubt, there was no other emotion. But these two short sentences were instantly full of a sense of tit for tat. It was impossible for Gu Hanzhan not to see Sai City beside Li Tianlan. It was also impossible for Li Tianlan not to know Gu Hanzhan. One was intentionally provoking him, while the other was blatantly looking down on him. Gu Hanzhan's eyes flickered, but he remained calm. The appearance of the young master of Kunlun City was indeed unremarkable and ordinary, but his eyes were full of absolute sharpness and dominance. He sat quietly in his seat, but he gave people an indescribable sense of mystery and danger. His eyes, which could leave a deep impression at any time, slowly glanced around. Some people in charge of special warfare agencies at the back of the venue seemed to want to stand up, but when they saw Gu Hanzhan shake his head slightly, they sat back down. Gu Hanzhan's eyes kept sweeping over several positions in the core area of the venue. The most central position of the venue was extremely limited, and it actually belonged to several superpowers. The Wang family of Beihai, Kunlun City, and Sai City, the three superpowers with experts of the invincible realm naturally deserved this position. In addition, Samsara must also have a place. Azure Dragon Gong Sun Chi of Jianghu State and his Terracotta Army were the nominal supreme leaders of this action, so they naturally had to be in the most central position. In addition, there was originally Mount Shu. But this time, it was Han Chongyang, the Yin and Yang Swordmaster, who came to Changdao, not Wei Kunlun, the Nirvana Swordmaster. So Mount Shu's position consciously moved backward. In this way, the situation suddenly became clear. Each of the five superpowers who were qualified to sit in the most central position could at least send a top expert of the half-step invincible realm. The Wang family of Beihai sent Firmament, and the Enchantress also vaguely had the combat capability close to the half-step invincible realm. Tribulation sent Deep Dream and Sunset Shadow were also the most outstanding assassins in Sai City in recent years. Samsara had Saint in charge, and in today's meeting, they were currently waiting for another important figure from Samsara. As for himself, the combination of Ice Crystal and Ice Frost Sword could be said to be a half-step invincible realm expert. In addition, his uncle Gu Zhendong was also here. Gu Hanzhan's eyes gradually burst out a trace of presumptuous brilliance. He quietly glanced in the direction of the Wang family of Beihai. Wang Xianxia yawned a little bored and whispered something to Firmament and the Enchantress beside him, as if he didn't care about the tension here at all. The Terracotta Army was destined to be neutral. As for Samsara, judging from the atmosphere between them and Li Tianlan just now, it seemed unlikely that they would make a move today. In this way, there was only Sai City left. Gu Hanzhan suddenly smiled, and his eyes became sharper. A smile appeared on his plain face, and there was an indescribable kind of exuberance. I'm the young governor of Kunlun City. What qualification do you have to sit next to me? It's a joke that the descendant of a traitor wants to enter the room. Gu Hanzhan's tone gradually became cold. It's a shame to sit with you. Now I have a suggestion. He moved his fingers and said indifferently, "Get out." In the future, when you rush forward, you should first ask yourself, do you deserve it? His voice echoed so clearly in the audience, calm and soft, but with a strong sense of humiliation and mockery. Tribulation moved his body. When he was about to get up, Li Tianlan suddenly reached out and pressed his shoulder. "What if I don't get out?" he asked calmly. "Descendant of a traitor, do you deserve it?" Gu Hanzhan looked at Li Tianlan lightly and asked, "I'm here now. Do you want to see for yourself whether I deserve it or not?" Li Tianlan's eyes became colder and colder. Gu Hanzhan laughed and said the same thing. "Descendant of a traitor, do you deserve it?" He smiled gently, but his eyes were full of disdain and disdain. "Well said. Descendant of a traitor, do you deserve to sit here? Get out." In the corner of the middle of the venue, a bald man suddenly stood up and shouted angrily, "Today, I finally know what shamelessness is. How dare you show up here? Think of the innocent souls killed by your father. Now, Li Tianlan, do you deserve it?" Another middle-aged woman stepped forward with a vicious sneer on her face. "Ha ha ha, a peerless genius with wind and thunder veins? You scared me. Do you deserve to be compared with the Wang family of Beihai and the young master of Kunlun City? Bullshit. They will be heavenly sons when they grow up. What about you? You're a scourge. Get out. Do you deserve to come to this venue? Get out. Traitor. Do you deserve it?" A terrible sound suddenly rolled up in the venue. The storm that had been brewing for a long time broke out completely. All the special warfare agencies related to Kunlun City stood up, and the sound was like a tide. The era of the Li family had long passed. Now in Jianghu State, there was only Kunlun City. They didn't need the Li family, nor did they welcome the former war god family. The sound waves spread layer by layer. For a moment, the words "do you deserve it" seemed to be the only thing in the world, echoing in Li Tianlan's ears. But the clearest voice was Gu Hanshan's. He still smiled gently, looked at Li Tianlan calmly and mockingly, and said, "Do you deserve it?" Li Tianlan also smiled. Bearing the condemnation around him, the corners of his mouth rose, and he smiled happily and comfortably. Under the watchful eyes of the crowd, he stood up. At the same time, a dazzling and sharp sword light also rose up. The sword light was like a waterfall. In an instant, it rose from the ground to the roof. All the lights were dim, and the whole conference room seemed to be split in half by a sword. The sword light crossed the venue but did not disappear. Instead, it completely condensed. There was no high temperature, no intention. Only the purest sword intent rose to the peak in an instant, with a sharpness that could tear everything. The 13th blade reverse scale. Under the bright sword light, there seemed to be darkness spreading around Li Tianlan. His figure disappeared for a moment. Gu Hanshan had already risen into the air. The raging fire suddenly burst out from his body, illuminating everything, but it could not illuminate the darkness around Li Tianlan. The sword light brought with it a strong killing intent and a violent rage. It flashed and disappeared from top to bottom. Light and fire blended with each other. The moment the sword light disappeared, countless sparks exploded around Gu Hanshan, splashing in all directions. The sword light suddenly spread all over the venue, and countless chairs exploded layer by layer. The clothes of some peripheral elites of Kunlun City sitting behind Gu Hanshan were all torn, and they looked embarrassed. In the fire, Gu Hanshan, who had risen into the air, fell down at a faster speed. His body landed steadily on the ground, but 2 streaks of blood shot out of his nostrils. Gu Hanshan glanced at Li Tianlan, and when he was about to speak, he suddenly spat out a mouthful of blood. The audience was in an uproar. The young master of Kunlun City was defeated. Gu Hanshan glanced at Li Tianlan expressionlessly, closed his mouth tightly, and sat down with the help of ice crystal and ice frost. Before entering Changdao, he had been chased by Heavenly Hound, the left advisor of Wuji Palace, for many days. Although he successfully entered Changdao under the cover of ice crystal and ice frost, he had not recovered yet. In a hurry, he faced Li Tianlan's full sword strike, and he could not exert his peak strength, so he suffered a loss. Li Tianlan's body was still standing in the air. The sword light and the fire had all disappeared. But the air around him was violently twisted. At the place closest to the chandelier in the venue, a void of darkness almost completely covered his body. In the darkness, Everyone could feel a pair of cold and indifferent eyes staring at them. That pair of eyes was constant and awe-inspiring, with inviolable pride and majesty. At this moment, no one in the venue was willing to face that pair of eyes. A clear, arrogant, calm, and crazy voice rang in everyone's ears, one word at a time, like thunder. My grandfather is Li Honghe. My father is Li Guangtu. My name is Li Tianlan. In the darkness his voice paused and then he said gloomily, You! Who do you think you are? Some people were in a trance. Some people looked furious. Some people looked cold. However, what most people felt was fear. Among all the people present, only one person looked sad, self-deprecating, and helpless. That was Thunder God. Chapter 200. Swords were drawn. The atmosphere in the venue was completely frozen. Gu Hanzhan slowly wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth and sat in his seat with a cold expression. He really did not expect that Li Tianlan would dare to fight on such an occasion. It was not a big deal for him to suffer losses and get hurt, but it made him extremely angry to lose face. After today, everyone present would think that he, the young master of Kunlun Immortal World, had lost to Li Tianlan. The sword just now was brilliant, but it also cast a shadow over his reputation as a young heavenly son. There were real reasons why he had not recovered from his serious injury and was caught off guard. But in the dark world, where the winner was king, what was the use of constantly emphasizing objective reasons? Not to mention whether anyone would believe it, even if someone did, so what? A defeat was a defeat. Gu Hanzhan twitched the corner of his mouth, and a violent killing intent flashed in his eyes. He closed his mouth tightly and said nothing. Li Tianlan still stood in the air. The darkness around him spread faster and faster, and the airflow kept twisting around him, as if to cover the whole venue. This was indescribable pride and arrogance. He was insufferably arrogant and had no one in his eyes. Just like what he said. Who do you think you are? The whole venue was silent for a moment. Then, a furious roar suddenly sounded in the venue. Bastard! Who do you think you are? In fact, there were two voices, but both the tone and the tone were almost exactly the same. When the two voices were combined, it was like a person roaring. The roar condensed with strong killing intent surged in the venue, and the echo of the roar was still floating in the air. Two beams of sword light had appeared in front of Li Tianlan at the same time. Tribulation, dressed in black, moved his body as if he wanted to get up, but he restrained his desire to make a move. The somewhat hot temperature dropped instantly, and for a moment, the whole venue seemed to enter a frost kingdom. The sword light scattered, and the darkness around Li Tianlan was constantly compressed. Streaks of sword energy with cold intent almost completely enveloped his body. In his sight, two figures appeared in front of him. Exactly the same face. Identical swords. Ice Spirit. Frost. Although the two swords had not merged into one, when they attacked at the same time, the sword intents of the same origin merged with each other, and this sword still burst out the power beyond the peak of the thunder-shocking realm. There were only the tips of the two swords left in Li Tianlan's pupils. The tip of the sword pierced through the air, bringing with it a pale, cold and sinister sword aura, and directly pierced towards his left and right heart. Faint exclamations of surprise rang out in the venue. His resolute killing intent swept across the entire area. For Li Tianlan, this sword strike was a sure kill. It was not only because the attacker was the famous Ice Crystal Frost Sword of Kunlun City, but also because this sword was similar to a sneak attack. The moment the sword energy flashed, the edge of the Ice Crystal Frost Sword had almost reached Li Tianlan's chest. The speed of this sword was completely indescribable, and it had even vaguely exceeded the scope of the thunder-shocking realm. Such a sword, which could be called the trump card, could not be used without paying a price, even if it was the Ice Crystal Frost Sword. To kill Li Tianlan, Kunlun City could hardly care less about its identity and face. The sword light was like a shooting star. But time seemed to be slowed down by countless times. The darkness around Li Tianlan kept retreating under the pressure of the sword light, and the scene in front of him became extremely clear. At this moment, Li Tianlan could clearly see the pale, cold sword energy condensing around him. He could even clearly see the natural lines on the edge of the Ice Crystal Frost Sword and the gloomy and vicious eyes of the person behind the two swords. The two swords pushed forward at the same time. A cold and chilly sword light shone in the venue. The sword light was like ice and snow, and the sword intent was as cold as winter. In front of the two sword lights that were as dazzling and cold as the winter sun, Li Tianlan felt destruction and also saw a slender and vigorous palm. In the white sword light with a trace of coldness in the snow, the hand appeared abruptly and naturally. It was a very clean and neat palm with a clear outline. Although it was not big, every knuckle was full of power. In the sword light that enveloped everything around, this hand directly reached in. In an instant, the surrounding sword intent all became chaotic. The palm slowly closed in the sword intent that was as cold as ice. Li Tianlan could almost clearly feel that the surrounding sword intent was completely crushed by this palm. The airflow around the palm twisted rapidly and finally formed a transparent whirlpool. In the extremely quiet space, the whirlpool suddenly spun wildly. The ice crystal sword and the ice frost sword that were close to Li Tianlan's chest suddenly began to tremble violently. The stalemate lasted no more than 3 seconds. With a muffled groan from the ice frost sword and the ice crystal frost sword, which were close to Li Tianlan's chest, the two swords suddenly lost control and clung to each other, falling into the palm that suddenly appeared. The sword intent brought by the ice crystal frost sword collapsed completely. A cold current suddenly rose in the venue, and the air was twisted into a circle of obvious air waves. The air waves were like tides, spreading to the whole venue with a powerful force. The whole venue was suddenly in chaos. Countless chairs were smashed under the impact of the airwaves. Some people in the middle of the venue even directly stood up to resist the sudden and rapid burst of power. Some elites of Jianghu state who were close to the door were even unable to resist. Under the impact of the almost majestic power, their whole bodies were lifted up, and they were thrown out of the door together with the pieces of chairs. The figures of the ice frost sword and the ice crystal sword were also blasted out more than 10 meters away, smashing into empty tables and chairs in the venue, bringing up a lot of smoke. Li Tianlan had already landed on the ground. A black figure walked past him at the same time as he landed and stopped in a small open space in the center of the venue. It was a figure wrapped in a black cloak. He was thin, mysterious, and strange. This was a figure that looked very lonely, but the moment Li Tianlan saw him, he felt that he saw a sea. Deep, surging, turbulent, and unfathomable. Saint Xianxia, who seemed not to notice Li Tianlan, but in fact, had been paying attention to everything in the venue, suddenly raised his eyebrows and whispered to himself, "No." Firmament, who was sitting beside him, shook his head slowly. The moment just now might seem long, but in fact, it was just a split second. But in that instant, it was enough for Firmament to feel the powerful and almost irresistible power of the other party. That was pure power and skill, not sword intent. "This is military counselor," Firmament said with a serious expression. Military counselor, who ranked second only to Saint among the 12 supermasters of Samsara, was also the most mysterious supermaster in Samsara. It could be said that today was the military counselor's first real fight. Before that, many people had even speculated whether the military counselor was an ordinary person without the strength to truss a chicken. There were even voices that speculated that Qin Wei Bai was the military counselor. But the supermaster of Samsara had completely proved how powerful he was in that moment of attack. In terms of strength, he was even a supermaster who was not weaker than the first supermaster Saint. "Your Excellency, who are you?" From the sneak attack of Ice Crystal Sword and Ice Frost to the appearance of the black-robed man, everything happened in the blink of an eye. When Ice Crystal Sword and Ice Frost landed on the ground, everyone finally reacted. Beside Gu Hanshan, Gu Zhendong, who had been silent, suddenly took a step forward, staring at the black-robed man who suddenly appeared, and asked in a low voice. Gu Zhendong was extremely burly, with thick eyebrows and big eyes. He looked like a valiant general, but in fact, for the dark world and the special warfare system of Jianghu state, this was a relatively strange name. In recent years, in Kunlun City, Gu Xingyun and Gu Qianchuan, two invincible realm experts, were enough to control any situation. Below them, there were some thunder-shocking realm experts who had just joined Kunlun City in recent years. In this way, except for a few direct descendants of Kunlun City who walked outside, other people rarely appeared, and Gu Zhendong was one of them. But their absence did not mean that they were not powerful. In a way, people like Gu Zhendong were the real core of Kunlun City, as well as the foundation of Kunlun City. For the superpowers in the dark world, an opponent that was not understood was the most terrifying opponent. "I'm military counselor," the man in the cloak said calmly. His voice was clear and elegant, giving people a feeling of extreme calmness and wisdom. Military counselor? Gu Zhendong frowned and repeated, Military counselor of Samsara? Not only military counselor of Samsara. He's also the military counselor of this operation. Military counselor's tone was indifferent. Gu Zhendong was silent and didn't speak for a long time. Although he didn't come out often in Kunlun City, his authority was extremely high. And before today's meeting, some superpowers roughly knew the content of this meeting. Today, nearly 2,000 elites of Jianghu State in Chongdao were led by Gong Sun Qi, the Azure Dragon of Jianghu State. Gong Sun Qi had the leadership, but military counselor had the command. Jianghu State attached great importance to this conflict that swept the entire dark world. Yi Dongsheng, known as the god of army, was in the rear, while military counselor came to the front. The highlight of today's meeting was to successfully connect military counselor in Chongdao with god of army in Jianghu State, make a battle plan according to the current situation, and emphasize military counselor's command. The final battle was about force as well as wisdom. Moreover, Jianghu State had newly established the Snowdance Corps, and Gu Qianquan was the first commander of the corps at a price. Giving up the leadership of East Island was one of the conditions put forward by Samsara when they cooperated with Jianghu State. In other words, military counselor who had the command could actually be on an equal footing with Gong Sun Qi, at least in East Island. From the perspective of this final battle, it was not an exaggeration to say that everyone in Kunlun City was now military counselor subordinates. Gu Zhendong felt depressed, but he didn't want to show weakness. He glared at military counselor and said with a cold smile, So what if you're military counselor? You have the command power in this final battle, but do you also have the power to intervene in our internal affairs? He pointed at Li Tianlan and said coldly, Do you want to stand up for this man? Everyone had noticed the fact that Samsara had cut off Li Tianlan. Although they didn't know what Samsara was going to do, military counselor had just saved Li Tianlan once. In any case, this should be against Samsara's current plan. Military counselor denied it as expected and said in a calm tone, I don't stand up for anyone, but your dog blocked my way. Is it wrong for me to kick it away? Dog. It seemed to be the first time that the famous Ice Crystal and Frost Sword of Kunlun City were called dogs since they became famous. Even when they joined forces and still lost to Wei Kunlun, the Nirvana Swordmaster of Mount Shu, no one dared to humiliate them like this. Gu Zhendong's face was cold. Ice Crystal and Ice Frost, who had just climbed up from the mess, also looked furious. The three of them looked at each other and rushed to military counselor almost at the same time without any hesitation. Kill! Gu Zhendong roared furiously, and a bolt of blue lightning with a hint of strange purple suddenly formed in front of him. In an instant, the air in front of him surged backward, and only the purple lightning was growing rapidly. Gu Zhendong took a step forward, and the extremely dazzling lightning shot out instantly, as if it had passed through the void, and reached military counselor in an instant. Military counselor's figure seemed to be blurred in place, as if he had moved, but also as if he hadn't moved. But the lightning had already passed him and flew behind him. Gu Zhendong was expressionless. Behind him, Ice Crystal and Ice Frost had already rushed up. Full force. No! Military counselor's eyebrows twitched suddenly. At such a delicate moment, he found that although Ice Crystal and Ice Frost's posture was extremely firm, they were not attacking, but defending. Defending against what? Almost instinctively, military counselor's heart shook, and he said subconsciously, Be careful. As soon as his voice came out, the purple lightning that passed through military counselor's figure had suddenly changed direction. The purple light instantly enveloped the whole venue. In the blurry light, Gu Zhendong's purple lightning had exploded into a light curtain. In the light curtain, killing intent was flowing, and thousands of sword intents covered Li Tianlan at the same time. It was still Li Tianlan. Gu Zhendong was expressionless, but there was determination in his eyes. From the standpoint of Kunlun City, Li Tianlan had to be killed no matter what, regardless of the occasion or place. As long as there was a chance, there should be no hesitation. Today's series of means might be despicable, but as long as Li Tianlan died, who would remember it as time passed? But Li Tianlan had to die. Not to mention how great a threat Li Tianlan would be to Kunlun City in the future. Even now, his existence would become a weapon used by some people with ulterior motives. There were too many inside stories behind Li Guangtu's incident. These years, Kunlun City had barely suppressed it. They thought that with the passage of time, this incident would become a thing of the past. But Li Tianlan's appearance was tantamount to giving others a reason to mention this incident again. For this reason alone, everyone in Kunlun City would feel terrified at the thought of it. They were not afraid of Li Tianlan's potential, but afraid of the series of unknown variables. As long as there was a chance to kill Li Tianlan, Gu Zhendong would not hesitate at all. In contrast, a little insult to Ice Crystal and Ice Frost was nothing. Whoosh! At the same time as the purple light exploded, an extremely sharp whistle sounded in the venue. A thick darkness directly wrapped Li Tianlan in it. Thousands of purple lights kept hitting the dark curtain around Li Tianlan. The black curtain shook violently and instantly shrank. In Gu Zhendong's gloomy expression, the black curtain wrapped in purple light flew to the top of the conference room at an extremely fast speed. Before everyone looked up, the black curtain had rushed out of the ceiling of the conference room. In the loud bang, a hole with a radius of about 10 meters was blown out of the ceiling. The sunlight from the outside world came in through the hole and perfectly blended with the light in the rising smoke and dust. Tribulation was already standing beside Li Tianlan. Under the mask, no one could see the expression of the King of Shadow clearly, but there was an undisguised violent killing intent in his low and hoarse voice. Tianlan is the young governor of Sai City. Gu Zhendong, you can kill him if you want. Do you really think that there is no one in Sai City? 4 consecutive transparent shadows surrounded Gu Zhendong at the first time. Tribulation's arms hung down, and 2 arm knives suddenly stuck out of his cuffs. Tianlan is my brother. Gu Zhendong, you can kill him if you want. Do you really think that there is no one in Mount Shu? On the other side of the conference room, Li Beitian suddenly pulled out the long sword beside him. Of course, this sword was not the Great Void Sword. But as the blade was unsheathed, Li Beitian's whole body emitted a kind of majestic sword intent that could almost go straight to the 9th heaven. Beside him, the Yin and Yang sword master of Mount Shu, Han Chongyang, sat still. All the swordsmen of Mount Shu around him also sat still, but their sword intent was concentrated on Li Beitian at the same time. At this moment, Li Beitian raised the long sword high. The bright blade trembled, and the amazing sword energy instantly crossed the distance of more than 10 meters and pointed directly at Gu Zhendong's throat. Tianlan is my brother. Gu Zhendong, you can kill him if you want. Do you really think that there is no one in the Eastern Theater of Operations? Ning Qianqing slowly stood up from the front seat of the Eastern Theater of Operations and said in a cold tone. The elites of the Eastern Theater of Operations came out in full force this time. Although there were only 2 thunder-shocking realm experts, more than 100 fire-flaming realm experts were a force that no one dared to ignore. When this force was all gathered together, no expert of the half-step invincible realm dared to fight head-on. Tianlan is my fiancé. Gu Zhendong, you can kill him if you want. Do you really think that there is no one in the Dongqing clan? Dongqing Yueshan and Thunder God stood up almost at the same time. Sai City, Mount Shu, the Eastern Theater of Operations, the Dongqing clan. The whole venue suddenly became noisy, and the sound of discussion rang out in every corner. Plus, there was Samsara, whose attitude was ambiguous. Whether it was inside Zhongzhou State or outside Zhongzhou State, once this force was united, it could completely compete with Kunlun City. As long as Li Tianlan grew up. No wonder Kunlun City was so impatient that they even used some unpresentable means. The sounds of discussion came one after another, becoming more and more chaotic. Gu Zhendong, who took the initiative to sneak attack but failed again, glanced coldly at Tribulation standing beside Li Tianlan, and then looked at Wang Xianxia. The force around Li Tianlan was obvious enough. If he really became powerful, then not only Kunlun City would be in trouble, but the Wang family of Beihai would also be in trouble. At this time, the Wang family of Beihai should always come out and say something. Wang Xianxia looked at Gu Zhendong strangely and suddenly said with a smile, "Why are you looking at me like this? Do you think that there is no one in the Wang family of Beihai?" Gu Zhendong was so angry that he almost vomited blood. He suddenly turned around and was about to speak, when a noise louder than the discussion suddenly rang out in the conference room. Everyone was taken aback and subconsciously raised their heads. In the center of the conference room, just above the military counselor's position, a hanging big screen had been turned on. The volume of the conference room was very loud, and the voice of the East Island host on the screen clearly echoed in every corner of the conference room. and the translator in the conference room immediately translated the host's Japanese into Chinese and spread it to the whole conference room. All the voices of discussion gradually disappeared. People's expressions began to change gradually, from the confusion at the beginning to surprise, then to seriousness, and finally to solemnity. At 10 o'clock this morning, the East Island military held a press conference. The military spokesman said that in the next 7 days, there would be a large-scale anti-terrorism military exercise in Chongdao. At present, the relevant departments were evacuating the people, and part of Chongdao would be turned into the exercise area. There was silence in the conference room, and only the voice of the host and the translator echoed. Evacuate the people for the exercise. This reason seemed far-fetched, but it was a reason after all. And don't forget, this was Chongdao, the most sparsely populated place in the whole East Island, and the place where they were hiding right now had even fewer people living nearby. If East Island used this area as a maneuver area, then the number of people who would be evacuated in the end would only be 100 or 200, and it would be a piece of cake. Obviously, East Island had begun to prepare for the battlefield. 7 days. The picture on the screen suddenly stopped. Gong Sun Chi's figure appeared at the door of the conference room. Looking at the messy scene in the conference room and the scary big hole in the ceiling, this azure dragon of Jianghu state smiled softly and walked into the conference room. His voice was gentle, and there seemed to be a little smile in it. Today is the first day. East Island people are preparing for the battlefield, and other dark forces are also preparing for the war. We, Jianghu state. Ha! He walked to military counselor and stopped. He glanced around and asked with a smile, "What are we doing in Jianghu state?" The whole conference room was quiet. Gu Zhendong, who didn't want to stop, hesitated and slowly sat down. Even Tribulation pulled Li Tianlan to sit in his seat. Gong Sun Chi was known as the person who was closest to the invincible realm in the dark world, and he could even be said to be the first person in the half-step invincible realm. Whether or not people were convinced by this title, he was now the supreme leader in the Battle of Chongdao. People still had to show him the respect he deserved. Tribulation patted Li Tianlan's shoulder gently, turned his head, and glanced at Gu Zhendong coldly. Gu Zhendong stared back at Tribulation without avoiding him, but his eyes were thoughtful. Although the fight with Tribulation was short, he had keenly sensed that something was wrong with Tribulation's state. When Tribulation attacked with all his strength, he seemed to be extremely powerful, but also extremely weak. This state made people feel quite weird. It was like one step to heaven and one step to hell, and Tribulation was standing on a wire rope between heaven and hell, swaying back and forth between glory and eternal damnation. Not to mention Tribulation's own mood. Even the others were a little scared when they saw this. This state. Tribulation seemed to be injured? Although I have the title of leader, I don't think I can lead you. I can't intervene in your grievances. But now, in the face of the war, I, Gong Sun Chi, beg you to put national affairs first, and I hope you can put some grievances behind the war. Gong Sun Chi turned 360 degrees and gave a military salute to the meeting place. He put down his arm and continued to say with a smile, "I wonder if you are willing to do me this favor?" No one spoke. There was silence in the meeting place. Gong Sun Chi nodded and said, "I'll take it as a yes." He waved the thick pile of materials in his hand and continued, "Let me introduce today's meeting. Military Counselor of Samsara Supermaster will meet with our God of Army, Marshal Yi Dongsheng, in this meeting to make the next battle plan. And in my hand is some intelligence, including the experts of East Island and other martial arts forces who are in East Island at this time. Of course, the intelligence is not complete, but it's better to know more than nothing. Here, on behalf of Jianghu State, I thank Samsara Palace for the intelligence. If you don't mind, let's start the meeting now. We don't have much time, so we have to hurry." The scene on the screen of the meeting place changed. Yi Dongsheng, the god of army of Jianghu State, who wore a military uniform and the rank of marshal, appeared on the screen. Through the screen, he obviously noticed the countless broken seats in the meeting place. He was a little stunned, but he didn't say much. He just looked away and looked at military counselor standing next to Gong Sun Chi. "Your Excellency Military Counselor, please take care of me," he said calmly and raised his hand to give a salute. "Take care of each other." Military Counselor bowed slightly, looking calm and indifferent. Military Counselor and God of Army. The moment the two successfully met, Even the slowest people in the meeting place felt the pressure and coldness of the approaching final battle. This was bound to be a long meeting. Li Tianlan had calmed down and listened carefully. Time passed slowly. He rarely spoke on behalf of Sai City, and most of the time, he was taking notes. The scorching sun turned into the setting sun in the meeting place. The fiery color in the sky gradually dimmed. The setting sun was about to disappear, but the bright moon had already risen. After the storm, East Island began to welcome dusk for the first time. Finally it became dark. When the night fell, it was also the time when the morning light was approaching. Time passed through the night in the meeting place, and it was close to dawn. Chapter 201. Time passed by the gorgeous rainy season, and the sky of Changdao was getting clearer and clearer. In the summer after the storm, the temperature rose quickly, and the hot sun shone on every corner of Changdao. Hot, dull, and depressing had become the theme of Changdao. The news about the military exercise of Changdao had been playing on TV. At 9 o'clock in the morning, when the news channel spread the news to every city in East Island again, there were still 6 days before the military exercise of Changdao. It was like a notice, but for some people, it was the most straightforward countdown. The war was coming. In the dull and hot weather, a large area in the southwest of Changdao had been completely emptied. It was an area of about 100 square kilometers, and most of it was mountainous. Usually, there were few people in this area. After the military of East Island designated this area as the military exercise area, the scattered civilians and a small village had all been evacuated. At this moment, under the clear sky, the mountains and rivers in this area were still the same, but the residents had all disappeared. It was like a dead zone full of vitality, but no one was there. Those who didn't know would never understand, but those who knew would know that this was the battlefield that the East Island officials had set in Changdao. It was an area with a radius of 100 square kilometers. It was a magnificent place. And this area had become a place where all the superpowers were studying. The map zoomed and enlarged on the screen, and the satellite images were transmitted in real time. Every corner of the southwest of Changdao was clearly shown on the screen as it zoomed in and out. The shabby curtains in the room were casually covered, blocking the hot and dazzling sunlight from the outside. An LCD screen that occupied almost the whole wall kept flashing. Jungles, mountains, rivers, lakes, parks, clubhouses. The satellite took pictures of all the terrains within a radius of 100 square kilometers and transmitted them to the screen. As the camera moved bit by bit, every part of the terrains became clear on the screen. The light in the empty room was dim. Only the misty light on the screen flickered, reflecting the entire room. The LCD screen that occupied the front wall could be said to be a very advanced device, but it seemed very out of place in the room. In terms of area, this was a rather large room, or even a hall, but there were no luxurious decorations in the hall. The curtains by the windows were dirty, and there was a set of shabby sofas that seemed to have been abandoned in the middle of the room. There seemed to be some spider webs in the corner, and in the dim environment, the surrounding walls seemed to have mostly peeled off. In such an environment, coupled with an advanced and luxurious LCD screen that was connected to a satellite, it seemed a little strange no matter how one looked at it. Several tall and short figures stood quietly in the hall. The hall was not small, and they did not stand together. Instead, they maintained a safe distance from each other. Although they were all on guard against each other, no one revealed any hostility. The image on the screen changed. It was silent. The few figures in the hall also stood silently on the spot, as if they were inanimate objects. Time continued to move forward as the screen continued to change. Light and shadow flickered in the dim hall, and the few figures stood still, looking gloomy and weird. This area is the battlefield that East Island left for us. In the oppressive and breathless silence, a person standing in the hall suddenly spoke, breaking the silence in the hall. He was the closest to the screen, and the light and shadow on the screen shone on him. His extremely skinny body also became clear in the light and shadow. From the view of the others, he looked like a skeleton in a black robe. The body under the black robe was empty, and there was an indescribable coldness about him. It looks big. That includes our current location. Another hoarse voice rang out. This voice was hoarse and strange, as if someone had torn off his vocal cords. It was a little unclear, and not only was it unpleasant to hear, it was even more terrifying to hear. But I still prefer to choose my own battlefield. I don't like this place. Ben, Is the Heroes Club willing to accept the arrangement of East Island? Ben, the vice president of the American Heroes Club, and the first vice president at that, was the most powerful figure in the entire Dark World. The Heroes Club could be said to be one of the oldest superpowers in the Dark World. Its internal structure was extremely complicated, and its strength was also extremely powerful. At its peak decades ago, its power could be described as overwhelming in America, and it was the most powerful superpower in the entire Dark World. Today's Heroes Club wasn't as dazzling as it was at its peak, but it didn't go downhill either. In the past 20 years, the Heroes Club's power kept expanding. 10 years ago it opened up Africa, 5 years ago, and it entered Northern Europe. Its sphere of power was getting bigger and bigger. In America, where they first made their fortune, the Heroes Club had maintained a fairly transcendent position, whether it was South America or North America. This time, the plot of Jianghu State affected the entire Dark World. The Heroes Club had already regarded the Battle of Changdao as an opportunity for them to penetrate into Asia. Ben, the first vice president, led the team to Changdao, which showed how cautious the Heroes Club was about the Battle of Changdao. The situation of the Dark World in Asia had been stable and weird for the past countless years. West Asia was in constant war, and it could be said to be the paradise of the Dark World. South Asia was full of fights for power and interests. The Dark World and politics were closely related, complicated and sensitive. In these two places, West Asia meant chaos. Although this word was the eternal theme of the Dark World, for the dark superpowers, excessive chaos also meant limited interests and possible unexpected losses. South Asia, on the other hand, meant trouble. The political factors, religious factors, ethnic hatred, and historical grievances combined to make the entire Dark World of South Asia extremely crazy. Although the superpowers in the Dark World were unwilling to give up these two areas, they hadn't been very diligent in their management for many years. As for East Asia and North Asia, they were the most stable places. North Asia and Eastern Europe had a large territory of snow country, which was the sphere of influence of the Polar Ground Alliance, the superpower in the Dark World. In the whole of North Asia and Eastern Europe, the Polar Ground Alliance could be said to be the only superpower. In addition, Snow Country's political situation had been stable in recent years, so other superpowers couldn't find a chance to enter North Asia. Even if there was a chance, the Polar Ground Alliance, which was born as a fighting nation, would often take the initiative to attack and stop all threats outside its sphere of influence. East Asia, on the other hand, seemed to have been drifting away from the superpowers in the Dark World in the past. Because Jianghu State, the world's well-deserved #1 superpower in both economy and military, was located here. Whether in the past or now, Jianghu State had only one superpower in the Dark World. That was the Wang family of Beihai. Whether it was the former Zhuanyuantai of Kunlun, the current Kunlun City, or Sai City, they could all be said to be dark superpowers, but most of the time in people's hearts, these superpowers were part of the special warfare system of Jianghu State, with a very strong official stance. The Wang family of Beihai in Jianghu State, the special warfare system of Jianghu State. The two superpowers in Jianghu State were enough to keep out any superpower that attempted to enter Jianghu State. The superpowers had fought with Jianghu State before, and this kind of competition still existed today. More than 20 years ago, when the Heroes Club was at its peak, it once joined forces with Fantasy World and the Polar Ground Alliance to invade Jianghu State. The old patriarch of the Wang family of Beihai and Li Honghe, the god of war of Jianghu State, joined hands and stopped several invincible realm experts outside the national border. In that battle, the old patriarch of the Wang family of Beihai fought desperately against the siege of 3 invincible realm experts, and returned with serious injuries after killing 2 invincible realm experts. A few years later, he died of illness. The Heroes Club, whose power was greatly reduced, also fell from its peak. 15 years ago, Night Spirit invaded Jianghu State. Jianghu State Sword Emperor Wang Tianzong, who had just entered the Invincible Realm, held the Human Emperor and killed Night Spirit, an invincible realm expert of Night Spirit, at the border with one spear strike, which shocked the whole Dark World. After a short silence, the Jiang family of South America began to be active in Jianghu State again, but it was always difficult to make a name for itself. 5 years ago, Samsara began to cooperate with Jianghu State, but it was guarded by Kunlun City and the Wang family of Beihai. Although there was no major conflict among the 3 parties, they often fought secretly. Jianghu State was the most powerful overlord in the world today, the center of the Dark World, but also a rare pure land in the Dark World. Under the deterrence of Jianghu State, the whole of East Asia was peaceful. Gaoshan State's position was ambiguous, and it wavered between the Western powers and Jianghu State. Although East Island was powerful, most of its forces had been guarding against the invasion of Jianghu State. The peaceful situation had always been under the control of Jianghu State. For the world's major dark forces, this was not what they wanted to see, because it meant too many interests and scruples. The dark forces of Jianghu State were the most aggressive in the world. Among them, the Wang family of Beihai was the most powerful, followed by Sai City, and then Kunlun City. This was not only because the Wang family of Beihai had Jianghu State's sword emperor Wang Tianzong, who was known as the #1 expert in the dark world. More importantly, all the forces in Jianghu State had an extremely stable rear. This was the most unique phenomenon in the dark world. The Heroes Club dominated America, but there was the Jiang family in South America, and Fantasy World in North America. The three forces entangled with each other while facing other forces. Europe could be said to be the most lively place in the dark world now. The remnants of Night Spirit, Samsara Palace, Dark Knights, Knights Templars, the Vatican, and various consortiums were entangled with each other. There were many conflicts that even the parties involved couldn't tell how they happened. The Polar Ground Alliance dominated Snow Country and Eastern Europe, but too many historical reasons doomed the Polar Ground Alliance to face a lot of troubles. Political problems and racial problems made the development of the Polar Ground Alliance extremely bumpy. Moreover, the dark world of Northern Europe was so chaotic every day that people were stunned. The Polar Ground Alliance did not have the opportunity to get out of it. Only Jianghu State. Within the territory of the most powerful country in the world, there were only their own people. Although other superpowers were stationed in Jianghu State, they didn't amount to much at all. When they were expanding, an extremely stable rear became the most unscrupulous reason for them to act. However, other superpowers didn't dare to attack with all their strength because of the restlessness in their backyards. Almost every superpower in the dark world had felt this kind of grievance, including Samsara Palace. Behind this kind of grievance often meant concessions and compromises, which meant absolute benefits, power, wealth, or resources. In short, they were what the superpowers in the dark world pursued. In the long run, as their compromises and concessions increased, Jianghu State would be powerful in all aspects to the point of suffocation. How could the giants in the dark world be willing to accept this? To invade Jianghu State, at least the Wang family of Beihai must be stopped. The footsteps of Kunlun City must be stopped in East Asia. This was everyone's bottom line. So for many years, as long as there was a chance, the superpowers would always focus on East Asia. While the superpowers were enemies with each other, they didn't mind cooperating occasionally when facing Jianghu State. They appeased Gaoshan Country, drew East Island to its side, flirted with some important figures in South Asia, and even directly invaded Jianghu State. All these were to limit the power of Jianghu State in the dark world. 20 years ago, the Heroes Club went east. 15 years ago, Night Spirit invaded. 10 years ago, the Jiang family of South America entered Jianghu State and quickly retreated. They took actions again and again, big and small, but every time they failed. As time went by, after Samsara and Jianghu State had a cooperative relationship, the superpowers in the dark world gradually quieted down. They all thought they had missed the best opportunity, but they didn't expect that Jianghu State would use a final battle to directly target East Island when it attracted all the attention in the dark world. East Island was in a precarious situation. Its economy and special warfare system could be said to be miserable now. But the superpowers in the dark world suddenly found that when East Island was miserable, Jianghu State also gave them a huge opportunity. It was an unprecedented opportunity, and also an unprecedented crisis. This was the situation that the superpowers didn't want to see the most, but it was also the opportunity they had been waiting for a long time. Similarly, this was also the reason why several people from various dark superpowers gathered in a shabby house at this time. With East Island as the border, we cooperate outside the border, and fight inside the border. How about that? Ben, who was wrapped in a black robe and looked like a skeleton, ignored the voices around him. He looked at the screen quietly, and after a long silence, he suddenly opened his mouth. He turned around. In the dark environment, his face was blurred, but his eyes were extremely bright, full of mysteriousness and treachery. We've been waiting for this day for a long time, haven't we? As the first vice president of the Heroes Club, Ben's strength was needless to say. He was definitely a figure who could be ranked among the superiors of the half-step invincible realm. But his fame didn't come from his strength, but from his insidiousness and cunningness. Ben's code name in the dark world was Ghost Fox, and he was good at deception, disguise, concealment, assassination, and escape. In the dark world, few legends about Ben were about his strength. He always appeared as the think tank of the Heroes Club and played the role of a schemer. This time, from the final battle of Jianghu State to the Battle of Chongdao, the Heroes Club didn't send anyone to the scene, but it could be said that the Heroes Club was the first superpower to enter East Island. It was also he who made an appointment with these people here today. This might not prove anything, but it was enough to show that Ben's sense of smell in the general trend was extremely sharp. I agree with what Crow said. In the dark, a deep voice rang out. I reserve my opinion. I'm not as smart as you, and I can only see what's in front of me. The current situation is that East Island has already used this area as a battlefield. As for the cooperation outside the border, I don't care, but I'll report it to my superior. In the shadow, a burly bald man walked forward and said in a cold tone. So what do you mean, King Bear? Ben's tone didn't change at all, and he asked in a low voice. The order I received is to attack Xianxia Palace and build a branch of the Polar Ground Alliance in East Island. King Bear's body moved agitatedly in the hall. In the shadow, he was like a grumpy monster. The attack on Jianghu State has nothing to do with the order I received, so... No, Mr. Bear King, I have to tell you that our cooperation doesn't conflict with the order you received. Ben smiled. King Bear of the Polar Ground Alliance could be said to be one of the most famous superiors of strength in the dark world. He had the Thunder Vein, and it had grown several times with the progress of martial arts. His power was so strong that it was comparable to that of the ordinary superiors of the invincible realm. But King Bear was a straightforward person. To put it bluntly, just like what he said, he wasn't very smart. So in the Polar Ground Alliance, although he had a high position and power, every time he took action, he would be followed by a top advisor. Today, King Bear came alone, but the advisor was nowhere to be seen, which was a bit strange. I can't guess what His Highness the Alliance leader is thinking, but I think in any case, His Highness will not let go of the opportunity to weaken Jianghu State. Attacking Xianxia Palace, and even building the headquarters of the Polar Ground Alliance in East Island, are all intended to contain Jianghu State. Ben's skeleton-like skinny body floated slowly in the hall, and his tone became more and more relaxed. I know you and Crow have doubts about this battlefield, but in my opinion, this battlefield is the most suitable place for us to play. For my plan, what East Island has done is simply perfect. Perfect. Crow sneered in a hoarse voice. He was the leader of Fantasy World in East Island this time. Although his status was not as high as Ben's in the Heroes Club, it was not much different, so he spoke without scruples. Sorry, I don't see what's perfect about it. I only see the stupidity of East Island. I admit that this is their home field, and we came to Chongdao to show our respect to them. But these stupid guys actually want to plan the battlefield? Who do they think they are? The Battle of Chongdao is right in front of us. When and where it will happen, can East Island completely control it? Can you fly? Ben suddenly asked. What? Crow subconsciously froze for a second. Yes, I can fly. But how far can you fly? This is East Island's home field, and it's not difficult for East Island to roughly locate us. Why do you think they can't plan the battlefield for us? Ben's tone was cold. Didn't you watch the news? The spokesman of East Island military said it was a military anti-terrorism drill. Crow, don't you understand? Military anti-terrorism drill. Crow muttered to himself, and his face suddenly changed. When there was a military drill, there would naturally be an army. This was common sense that everyone knew. Maybe you should go outside and have a look? Ben squinted his eyes and said with a smile. Crow's face was gloomy. His figure flashed, and he already appeared by the window. They were now in an old city area that was about to be demolished, just in the suburbs. When East Island planned the battlefield, they directly included this area. According to the satellite map, this old city area was just on the edge of the battlefield. At this moment, in Crow's sight, a large number of ordnance had been transported here, and soldiers in East Island military uniforms were coming slowly from afar. Armored vehicles could be seen everywhere, and it looked like they had completely surrounded this place. Crow's face was gloomy and cold, and his whole body was filled with undisguised killing intent. 10 years ago, his throat was injured, and he was almost cut with a sword. And the initiator was the current #1 superior of East Island, Tianhai Wuji, who was trapped in Jianghu state. Therefore, Crow didn't like East Islanders at all. Looking at the approaching army, his eyes gradually became crazy, with crazy killing intent. East Island dares to send troops to the conflict in the Dark World? Crow's smile was cruel and gloomy. Are they crazy? They're just practicing, and they won't join the war blatantly. Ben shook his head. None of the superpowers that could become giants in the Dark World were simple. Behind every superpower, there were more or less political factors. In Jianghu state, the Wang family of Beihai was the head of the Southeast Group. Kunlun City was the highest special warfare agency in Jianghu state. Sai City could also dominate Mount Tai-Bai in the northeast. The Polar Ground Alliance was in Snow Country, and its involvement with the energy oligarchs and even the military and government of Snow Country would only be more complicated. Fantasy World was deeply rooted in North America, and it was also supported by a strong power. In this case, if they used the army to solve the conflict in the Dark World, it was tantamount to suicide for East Island, which was not strong in military power. Once such a thing became a fact, it would be a war, and there would be no room for negotiation. So it was basically impossible for these soldiers to join the war. But if they didn't join the war, they could block the battlefield. In the territory of East Island, if East Island wanted to fight, everyone could see it. No matter who it was, they had to obey the will of East Island. This was the home advantage of a country. Look, what a spectacular scene. Ben came to Crow and said with a smile, "It fits perfectly with my plan. Everyone, I think we can talk about my plan now." The blockade plan. Blockade? Crow twitched the corner of his mouth. In the dim light in the hall, his expression was not obvious, but the mockery in his tone was obvious. "Ben, is your plan to block us all?" "You can say that," Ben said blandly. "At least on this battlefield, we can't get out, but neither can the people of Jianghu state." Crow and King Bear froze at the same time. The power of Jianghu state is too scattered, and they are too confident. East Island, Northern Europe, North America, and their own base camp, they are indeed powerful, but they can't be so extravagant. If the people of East Island trap the elites of Jianghu state here, if Knights Templars and Fantasy World start to fight back against the power of the Snowdance Corps in North America and Northern Europe, what will happen to Jianghu state? Ben asked with a smile. "They will definitely support us," King Bear said without hesitation. This was a truth that everyone understood. As a newly established super-elite legion in Jianghu state, the Snowdance Corps' internal lineup was completely stunning. According to the news they received, Jianghu state had 3 young heavenly sons, 2 invincible realm experts, a large number of young geniuses, and the backbone of the special service generation, including a super assassin like Tribulation. This force could almost be said to be the most reliable force of Jianghu state. Using them to deal with East Island showed how determined Jianghu state was this time. But no matter how determined Jianghu state was, it was impossible for Jianghu state to watch them fall into a desperate situation. Once the elites of Jianghu state were trapped in East Island, and Fantasy World and Knights Templars exchanged battlefields to attack Situ Tsungyue and Gu Qianchuan, Jianghu state would definitely support them without any hesitation. "Oh, support." Ben nodded. "But what if they have a reason not to support us?" "What do you mean?" Crow's tone was cold, but his eyes gradually lit up. "For example, here." Ben straightened his body and switched the screen. A map of Jianghu state appeared on the screen, with vast mountains and rivers and beautiful mountains and rivers. Ben pointed at the border and said indifferently, "Between the Snowdance Corps and the Border Praetorian Corps, which one is more important to Jianghu state?" "The Border Control Corps." Crow's and King Bear's faces changed at the same time. "We are enemies of each other, yes. But enemies also pursue common interests. On the matter of Jianghu state, our position is the same. So, maybe we can really cooperate for once. Jianghu state and Samsara dare to disperse their forces, but don't we dare to disperse our forces?" Crow's eyes were shining and hesitant. He seemed to be hesitating and afraid. This is the best chance, and maybe the last chance. After the fall of the Li family in Jianghu state, although Gu Xingyun became the war god of Jianghu state, he has been busy consolidating his position for many years. In the early stage, he had to face the suspicion of others in Jianghu state. In the middle stage, Sword Emperor Wang Tianzong killed Heavenly Spirit with one shot and stole too much of his limelight. After a few years of peace, samsara appeared again. Kunlun City seemed to be prosperous, but in fact, it has not been comfortable these years. Otherwise, why would Gu Xingyun make so many deals with us? But this time is different. Gu Xingyun has almost consolidated his position. This time, Jianghu state conspires against East Island. Samsara is the leader, but Gu Xingyun is the promoter. Obviously, Gu Xingyun needs a huge victory to completely walk on the altar. If Jianghu state wins this time, Jianghu state will not only open a gap in East Island, but also let none of us have a good time in the future. Now we have such a good chance to give Jianghu state a fatal blow. I don't understand. Why are you hesitating? Ben took a deep breath, took out a cigarette and lit it. He said indifferently, as long as the five of us work together, no matter what Jianghu state does, it can't win. There was no doubt about that. No one would doubt this. Once they joined forces to invade Jianghu state again, Jianghu state was bound to be in a difficult situation. Support the Border Control Corps? The Snowdance Corps was about to give up. Support the Snowdance Corps. Once the Border Control Corps was forced, it was not just a matter of losing face because the National Gate was invaded. The Border Control Corps was the most elite combat corps of Jianghu state. Jianghu state could not afford to lose it either. Now the Snowdance Corps was acting in North America, Northern Europe, and East Island. Although they all had a tacit understanding with Jianghu state, as long as Jianghu state was strangled, those outside Jianghu state could not go back, and those inside Jianghu state could not come out. This was the real blockade. But, Wang Tianzong. Crow opened his mouth and spat out a name. The pressure that this name brought was just too great, causing Crow's tone to become sluggish and sluggish. The top expert on the divine list. The Sword Emperor of Jianghu state held the first murderous weapon in the dark world, Human Emperor. This was not a name at all. It was a mountain that pressed on everyone's heart. Jianghu state conspired against East Island in the general trend. But all the superpowers conspired against Jianghu state in the general trend. But Wang Tianzong. How to deal with it? If Wang Tianzong takes action, someone will stop him. A peaceful voice suddenly sounded in the corner of the hall. Holy Light, the deputy commander of Knights Templars. Crow couldn't speak for a while. Thinking of the behemoth behind Knights Templars, which had a small territory but boundless faith, Crow seemed to understand something vaguely. We can't give up on East Island either. Holy Light said with firm and persistent eyes, we are still maintaining a cooperative relationship with East Island, and we have even paid a lot. Of course. Ben said with a smile, we will all stay in East Island. As for who will go to Jianghu state, it's the business of His Highnesses behind us. Holy Light nodded. His white robe seemed out of place in the dark hall, filled with a kind of holy radiance. All the superpowers in the dark world were constantly fighting for interests. But Knights Templars had always been spreading faith in fierce means. The road ahead of Knights Templars was the Holy War. It would never end. Holy Light suddenly frowned and said thoughtfully, and if this thing succeeds, I want a person. Okay. Crow said first, if this thing succeeds, you have contributed the most, and Fantasy World will have no problem with who you want. Our Jiang family has no problem with that. But we can give him to you except Li Tianlan. This guy is related to the destiny of our Jiang family for hundreds of years. If Knights Templars want him, then I have to say sorry. In the dark hole, there seemed to be a void passing through the eaves and spreading in the room. A vague illusory shadow walked into the room and said with a smile, sorry, I'm late. Evil. The crow subconsciously raised its voice. We have met. In the hall, the only invincible realm killer in the dark world seemed to chuckle. But I didn't know you well enough before. To show my sincerity, I would like to introduce myself again. Jiang Chenhua of the Jiang family of South America, codename Evil. Fantasy World. Heroes Club. Polar Ground Alliance. Knights Templars. Jiang family of South America. 5 families gathered. The living room was strangely quiet for a moment. Then Holy Light broke the silence again. Sorry. He said softly but firmly, what we want is also Li Tianlan. Jiang Qianhua said in a playful tone. Is this an order from your chaotic highness? Holy Light narrowed his eyes slightly and looked straight at the illusory shadow in front of him. He said calmly, No. It's His Majesty's prophecy. Everyone's face changed. Evil's expression instantly became extremely ugly. His Majesty. In the dark world, this was a very special word. And there were only two people who deserved this word and could make them sincerely awe. One was the Sword Emperor of Jianghu State, Wang Tianzong. In the misty darkness of the Wang family of Beihai, the Sword Emperor's sword was enough to make people feel desperate. And the other one? He was not in the dark world, nor was he an invincible realm expert. He controlled the most extreme and crazy dark power in the dark world, but he had been walking in the brightest light and moving forward in the praise of people. From the light to a brighter light. Chapter 202. The night was as cool as water, and the moon was bright and the stars were sparse. Ninghu had the cleanest sky and coast in the whole East Island. Looking from a distance at night, the sky and the sea were closely connected, with a kind of pure and awe-inspiring power. Whether it was day or night, Wuxia Mountain in the northeast of Ninghu was the best place to view the scenery. There was a cliff on the edge of Wuxia Mountain near the sea, which was nearly 1,000 meters above sea level. It was the highest place near Ninghu City. The cliff was not big, but it was magnificent, especially at night. Standing on the cliff, listening to the sound of waves, the endless pure sea in front of them, and the continuous bright lights of Ninghu behind them, it was an indescribable feeling. It seemed that the prosperity of the city and the profoundness of the sea were all under their feet, which made people feel that everything in Ninghu was under their control. Qin Weibai didn't remember how long she had been standing here. From sunset to nightfall, the sky became purer and the moon became brighter. Time kept moving forward, and only the cliff under their feet remained unchanged. Qin Weibai was also motionless. She just stood there quietly, with her back to the bright lights behind her, looking at the deep sea in front of her. She seemed to be meditating, but also seemed to be observing something. The sea breeze in the middle of the night blew over with a cold chill. Qin Weibai's white retro dress and black hair danced with the wind at the same time. In the night wind, her face had a kind of almost transparent paleness, but her eyes, which were always focused, were as bright as stars, soft and persistent. The sea breeze blew over the cliff, sprinkling on Wuxia Mountain with a delicate fragrance. Qin Weibai, who had been silent for a long time, finally opened her mouth and said softly, "What do you feel?" Behind her, two black shadows stood quietly, as if they had been completely integrated into the night. The two were of similar height, and their clothes were exactly the same. They both wore black cloaks, and the wide brims of the hats completely covered their faces. When they lowered their heads, their expressions were completely immersed in the darkness, and no one could see any outline. Nothing. The two figures in the cloaks seemed to look at each other, and then shook their heads with great tacit understanding. When the two of them stood together, they looked like a mirror image under the curtain of the night. However, there were some subtle differences between them. The difference was in the decoration and temperament. The figure in the black cloak on the left seemed to be straighter, carrying a long sword. Although he didn't move, there seemed to be endless sword energy hovering around him. The sword energy moved with the wind and kept gathering in the slight whistling sound, vaguely with a kind of sharpness and fierceness that went straight to the ninth heaven. In comparison, the figure under the black cloak on the right was much more peaceful. He just stood there casually, without any sharp or domineering aura. There was only a kind of steady and somewhat frightening calmness and indifference, like the vast ocean under a cliff. When the wind was calm and the waves were calm, it gave off an almost unfathomable feeling of profoundness. Saint. Military counselor. Since the appearance of the Samsara Palace in the Dark World, they had been the two most mysterious supermasters in the Samsara. No one knew their true identities, but in the repeated confrontations in the Dark World, all the dark superpowers had felt their power. As the was. When the mysterious palace was silent, the palace would king. Saint and military counselor were the force and wisdom of the Samsara Palace. They always appeared at the most opportune time and disappeared at the most improbable time. For several years, except for the master of Samsara Palace, no one knew their identity, and no one could capture their traces. Like now. When the cooperation between the Samsara and Jianghu state was at the most critical stage, no one thought that Qin Weibai, the key figure, would show up in East Island. She went from Dongdu to Changdao and finally to Ninghu. Also, no one thought that the two strongest supermasters of the Samsara, who were supposed to be preparing for the war in Changdao, had also avoided the surveillance of East Island and secretly came to Ninghu. Didn't you feel it? Qin Weibai murmured to herself. In the cool air formed by the night wind and the waves, her black hair and white clothes fluttered in the wind. Qin Weibai didn't look embarrassed at all. Instead, she stood up proudly with her tall and slender body. Facing the sea. Facing the bright moon. Facing the starry sky. The scene this time was truly as beautiful as a painting with an unparalleled celestial bearing. I felt danger. Qin Weibai breathed softly and said calmly. Danger. The sword intent around Saint suddenly froze. To be exact, it's the forbearance and ambition of an ambitious man for many years. Qin Weibai smiled. The moonlight shone softly, and her whole body seemed to emit a hazy and dreamy light. Looking at the sea in front of her, her tone was soft, but with a hint of indifference. This place is very special. It's so special that I've been looking for it for a long time. Ambitious man? Military counselor repeated and then smiled softly. Standing behind Qin Weibai, both military counselor and Saint were much more natural than the other supermasters. At least they weren't as cautious as the other supermasters. Even their tone was natural, as if they were chatting. In your eyes, this is not an evaluation that anyone can afford. In the dark world, although Qin Weibai didn't have the title of a giant, she exercised the power of a giant. Standing at her current height, there were only a few people in the dark world who could be evaluated as ambitious men by her. It's not a matter of whether I can afford it or not. Qin Weibai's tone was complicated, with mockery, coldness, and a little absent-mindedness. He is an ambitious man. He doesn't need anyone's evaluation. This place is his foundation and his hope. Unfortunately. She paused. At this moment, Qin Weibai's white dress fluttered. She turned her back to Saint and military counselor, so no one could see her expression clearly. But there seemed to be a sense of sadness spreading on the cliff. Unfortunately, I still found him. Saint and military counselor looked at each other again. After a short silence, Saint tentatively said, Then tonight we come here. To wait for someone and kill someone. Qin Weibai's answer was simple. Saint and military counselor also fell silent and didn't ask more. The superpowers in the dark world had their own unique labels. The Wang family of Beihai was powerful, the Jiang family of South America was low-key, the Knights Templars were fanatical, the Dark Knights were extreme, the Polar Ground Alliance was insidious, and so on, and the label of Samsara was mysterious. The way Samsara operated, the location of their headquarters, and the specific strength of the master of Samsara Palace were all unknown to the dark world. In people's minds, as the top two supermasters in Samsara, the famous saint and military counselor, who almost never showed up, should have the status and power second only to the master of Samsara Palace and Qin Weibai. But the actual situation was the opposite. Samsara and Saint did have a high status, but they were not responsible for anything in Samsara Palace. It could be anything. In terms of actual power, any supermaster in Samsara who was below Saint and military counselor had more power than the two of them. Saint and military counselor, most of the time, played the perfect executors when Samsara needed them. They just did things regardless of the reason. When they were not needed, they were like two shadows inside Samsara Palace, almost without any trace of their existence. Especially after Qin Weibai appeared, the two of them carried out this style of only doing things to the extreme. From Changdao, they secretly escorted Qin Weibai to Ninghu. Until now, Saint and military counselor didn't know what Qin Weibai was going to do, and they didn't need to know. Wait for someone, kill someone. That was enough, and they didn't need to ask more. Time passed in silence. After midnight, the area around the cliff became quieter and quieter. Only the sound of wind and waves swept past people's ears. A fishing village less than 3 kilometers below the cliff was completely silent. After the lights went out, all the areas of Wuxia mountain became completely dark and silent. Military counselor yawned out of boredom and suddenly said, "What will you say after this is over?" "Go back home. There are a lot of things in the country. Just thinking about it gives me a headache." Saint was surrounded by sword energy, and his momentum was amazing. But his voice turned from hoarse to clear, as if he was a little helpless. Military counselor's voice also contained a hint of a smile. He nodded and said, "You've been doing a lot lately." "You've been doing a lot more than me, haven't you?" "I'm not doing a lot. Things that were already in the bag could be left to the children to practice. But recently, I found that there's one more expert in hooting. You can't imagine who he is. He's a person that we all paid attention to but ignored. If he hadn't gone to Jinling as soon as he arrived in hooting, maybe I wouldn't have found him. What is hiding? Now I've seen it." "An expert? At least not much worse than you and me. But this person has always been restless. Now that he's backed by a big tree, it seems that he still won't stop. If I'm right, there will be a three-surnamed slave in modern society." "Hey!" In military counselor's playful voice, Saint's body under the cloak slightly tightened. The words three-surnamed slave made him immediately think of who the so-called expert was. "It's him? Did I see it right?" That's why people say that a real person doesn't show his face. In the following time, I plan to study this person carefully. But his appearance in hooting is not a bad thing for us, at least for now. Military counselor took out a cigarette and lit it. Faint smoke blew out from the cloak. He looked at Qin Wei-bai, who was motionless in front of him, and suddenly said with a smile, "Boss, you don't seem to be surprised by this news at all?" "There is no three-surnamed slave. All these years, he has only one position, and it has never changed." Qin Wei-bai said faintly, "A person who can endure for many years even if his own daughter was killed, his loyalty and sacrifice are worthy of respect. But I just don't know from his standpoint, whose slave is he?" In the darkness, military counselor shrugged and seemed to smile bitterly. Samsara's almost all-pervasive intelligence system was definitely enough to make anyone feel afraid. The secret pawns of some superpowers and the truth of the things that happened many years ago were completely exposed in the search of Samsara's intelligence system. There were no secrets at all. And such a strict intelligence system had always been in the control of Qin Wei-bai. Military counselor thought that the news he said was shocking enough, but he didn't expect that the boss had already known the information and even knew it in more detail than him. Military counselor smiled helplessly and subconsciously glanced at Qin Wei-bai. Under the bright pale moonlight, this amazing woman who made several giants in the dark world fall head over heels for him only showed him the back of a peerless beauty. She faced the sea, but turned her back to the whole world. In military counselor's impression, the boss a few years ago had always been quiet and beautiful, quiet like a statue of a god carved out of ice that had been frozen for thousands of years. Every move of his had been unattainable, perfect and noble, and could only be admired by others. A few months ago, the boss was happy. He could clearly feel the look in the boss's eyes at that time. It was a touch of satisfaction, but with unforgettable gentleness. But now, military counselor could only feel her loneliness. The loneliness that went deep into the bone and the soul. Military counselor opened his mouth and wanted to say something, but he didn't know why he couldn't say a word. Finally, he closed his mouth and kept silent. A soft phone ring sounded in the night. Qin Wei-bai, who had stood motionless for a long time, took out her mobile phone and answered it, but she didn't speak. On the phone, Duke's calm and steady voice sounded. "Boss, Daybreak has just responded to my request on behalf of His Highness." "What did he say?" As her white dress and hair fluttered in the wind, Qin Wei-bai's delicate body, which no one dared to profane, suddenly tightened. "Daybreak told me that they can get what we want, but not much, and it takes time," Duke said in a low voice. There was silence. There was a dead silence on the cliff in an instant. Qin Wei-bai held the phone tightly in her hand, and her body began to tremble slightly in the silence. The trembling became more and more obvious, but her tone seemed to be suppressing the storm and tide in the deep sea. "He said they can get it?" Qin Wei-bai asked calmly. Even through the phone, Duke still seemed to feel a great danger coming. His voice was lower and he said carefully, "Daybreak said so." "Good." Qin Wei-bai nodded. After a full minute of silence she said again, "Good." "What a goodly." In the night wind, her somewhat sharp voice paused and then became absolutely calm again. "I got it," she said, and then hung up the phone. Saint and military counselor were silent. Military counselor took a slight step back. Around him, the airflow within a radius of several meters suddenly twisted violently. The sword energy around Saint swirled wildly, like a storm. The two of them didn't know what Qin Weibai's phone call meant, but they knew that the last time their boss spoke in this tone was less than 24 hours ago. The Knight Spirit organization was destroyed. Saint and military counselor entered the fighting state almost immediately. At this moment, the two supermasters, no matter who they were facing, only had the fighting desire left. This time, our samsara cooperates with the mysterious ally of East Island. Do you know what I want? Qin Weibai took a deep breath and suddenly asked. You want them to guarantee Li Tianlan's safety? Military counselor said slowly. Yes. I paid a lot just to let them protect Tianlan's safety. But other than that, I also want some other things that are very rare but very difficult to find. Qin Weibai's tone was crisp and cold. Her pleasant voice was full of a strong and suffocating murderous aura. I want the coldest poison and the hottest poison. Have you heard of these two things? You haven't. But why do they know what they are? And they can take them out? Ha! Clap. Qin Weibai threw the phone in her hand onto the cliff. Her delicate and perfect face was bathed in the moonlight, but there was undisguised coldness and anger in her tone. What is right and wrong? What is grievance? What is friendship? Her tone was getting louder and louder, and her rising voice echoed on the whole cliff. It was so majestic that it could break gold and crack stones. Military counselor and Saint didn't say a word. As far as they could remember, Qin Weibai had never behaved like this before. This seemed to be the first time that she did not hide her anger and indifference at all. Her venting sounded like she was interrogating them, but also with strong resentment. Saint, Qin Weibai suddenly said in a heavy tone, I want to kill someone. My pleasure. Saint took a step forward and said in a neither humble nor arrogant tone, Who do you want to kill, boss? The real young heavenly son. Do you dare to kill him? Qin Weibai bent down, picked up the phone on the ground, and turned on the screen. On the screen, the photo of her and Li Tianlan snuggling together immediately came into view. Qin Weibai's cold, majestic, and bright eyes softened quietly. She carefully wiped the dust off the screen, and the killing intent in her tone grew stronger and stronger. The saint remained calm and said, It's my pleasure. Military counselor? Qin Weibai called out without turning her head. Military counselor smiled slightly. His tone was very implicit, but the content was straightforward and explicit. In my heart, Tianlan is the only young heavenly son. Except for Tianlan, there are no other young masters that I can't kill. This flattery was quite shameless, but it was extremely effective. Qin Weibai's anger began to subside quickly, and even her tone became much softer. Tianlan, she murmured softly, shook her head, and said, If he doesn't die tonight, he may become Tianlan's strongest opponent in the future, the only one. Even Saint and military counselor were a little moved by such an evaluation. Li Tianlan's current potential had long been recognized. Not to mention his current realm, just in terms of potential, no one thought that he would be any worse than Wang Xianxia and Gu Hanzhan. When such a person grew up, he only needed to enter the thunder-shocking realm to make the masters of the half-step invincible realm feel tricky. Li Tianlan's strongest opponent in the future? The only one? Saint, who didn't speak much but would carefully remember every word of Qin Weibai, suddenly said, Because of talent? As expected, Qin Weibai shook her head but didn't say much. Saint glanced at her thoughtfully. It's my honor to help the man you love the most. Military counselor flattered like a tide, but his voice was implicit and sincere. The man you love the most? Qin Weibai asked back. Military counselor's expression froze. He simply hid his face in the cloak, and others couldn't see it. He kept smiling and said, Boss, you don't love him? I love him. Qin Weibai nodded and said softly, It's just, do I deserve it? Do I deserve it? She asked a question, but it wasn't about military counselor or saint. It was more like she was interrogating her soul in a very serious manner. Do I deserve it? She stood silently at the edge of the cliff, proudly straightening her body. At that moment, the military counselor could clearly feel that under the boss's beautiful appearance, all the energy, qi, and spirit had been sucked out in an instant. Her entire person was filled with a kind of emptiness and despair. Boss. Saint and military counselor spoke at the same time. I'm fine. Qin Weibai suddenly came back to her senses, and she became cold and piercingly cold again. Beside the cliff, the beauty looked up at the moon. The pure blue night sky was bright, and the sparse stars were shimmering. A bright, almost dazzling star abruptly fell from the extreme end of the sky in an exaggerated arc. The star tore up the moonlight and fell into the deep sea. The general star fell, and the heavenly sun should die. Qin Weibai's beautiful face gradually bloomed with a smile that could almost topple a country. It's hard to defy destiny. It seems that tonight is a lucky night. Boss, do you also believe in destiny? Saint asked with a gentle laugh. If I didn't believe in destiny, how could I live until now? Qin Weibai's eyes were bright and lonely. She looked down. After midnight, when dawn was approaching, two vague figures finally appeared in the farthest distance of her sight. The two figures were extremely fast, and their destination was very clear. They climbed Wuxia mountain and went straight to the cliff. The figures were getting closer and closer. The silhouettes of a man and a woman gradually came into view. Saint and military counselor's eyes suddenly focused. Until this moment, they didn't know who the boss was waiting for. When military counselor and Saint secretly sneaked into Ninghu, no one noticed that a famous superior of the Wang family of Beihai's camp was also missing. Black Pupil from the Wang family of Beihai. And the one who appeared with Black Pupil was a sensitive figure like Qin Weibai who shouldn't have appeared in East Island. He shouldn't have appeared, and he shouldn't have met the current Qin Weibai in the current situation. The man and the woman moved forward quickly. Black Pupil followed them silently. The young man in front of her strode forward as if he were taking a stroll in a courtyard. The Wang family of Beihai. Chapter 203. The moonlight covered every corner of Wuxia mountain. The sea in the middle of the night gently undulated, and dense water vapor rose. In the deep night, the water in the mountain was moist, and the outside of the mountain was hazy. People on the mountain looked down the mountain. People at the foot of the mountain looked up at the top of the mountain. They were all sceneries. Qin Weibai was motionless. Her calm gaze seemed to pass through the night and fell directly on Wang Xiaoyao and Black Pupil. Black Pupil, who was walking up, instinctively stopped and looked up at the white clothes on the cliff at the top of the mountain. Her black pupils, which could hardly see any white of her eyes, flickered with dim light, mysterious and quiet. Her white clothes and long hair fluttered in the wind. Her flawless and delicate face. Her eyes were as clear as water but cold and bright. All the scenes on the top of the mountain appeared in Black Pupil's sight. Her dark eyes even clearly reflected Qin Weibai's figure. They were like two white dots in his pupils, and only two white dots. All the scenes on the cliff disappeared. In a trance, it seemed that only her figure stood quietly, bathed in the moonlight between heaven and earth. She was proud, indifferent, perfect, and sharp. Unparalleled in the world. That feeling went far beyond the so-called charm and beauty, but became a shock that people dared not touch and profane. Qin Weibai. Black Pupil subconsciously lowered her head, avoided the gaze on the mountain, and asked. Among the many experts of the Wang family of Beihai, Black Pupil was not the strongest, but she was not the worst. But she was definitely one of the people who left Beihai province the least. She had heard of the title of the first beauty in Jianghu state, but she had never had the chance to see it. Until now, she really understood that excessive beauty could also make people feel fear and danger. Wang Xiaoyao responded in a low voice, and there was a struggle in his eyes. Black Pupil's eyebrows moved, and a dark cloud gathered between her eyebrows, obscure and strong. The intelligence of the Wang family of Beihai still clearly showed that Qin Weibai was still in Jianghu state. At this time, she appeared in East Island without anyone knowing, which was a very unusual thing. In other people's cognition, Wang Xiaoyao, who was also in Jianghu state, secretly sneaked into East Island at this time and contacted Qin Weibai late at night, which suddenly made this matter more unusual. Qirome sighed softly. She wanted to say something but stopped on second thought. In the end, she didn't say anything. When Firmament and the Enchantress were both in East Island, Wang Xiaoyao, who came to Changdao secretly, only brought her here, which was enough to explain some problems. This night was destined to be unusual. Some things that should have happened would inevitably be foreshadowed in the general trend, and no one would be able to stop them. Ahead, Wang Xiaoyao kept walking. Without the slightest hesitation, Qirome followed. She couldn't stop because the person in front of her was still going up. She did not know how far the man in front of her would go, but as long as she was still here, she would follow him. Even if she was alone. Wang Xiaoyao walked through the path covered with stones and rushed to the cliff with the shortest route in the shortest time. His forehead was already sweating. The cliff was extremely high. Compared to the surrounding Wuxia mountain, it was unique. The whistling night wind blew past the top of the cliff. His sweat quickly became cold, but the coldness did not disappear. Instead, it seeped into his skin and continued to permeate his body. In the late summer night, in the cold wind by the sea, Wang Xiaoyao felt like falling into the ice field, and his whole body was extremely cold. The corner of his mouth moved. Looking at Qin Weibai in front of him, his eyes were complicated, and he said softly, "There are too many people here, so I'm late." The meaning of this sentence was extraordinary. At least it meant that Wang Xiaoyao wanted to avoid more than some monitoring forces of East Island. It was quiet on the cliff. Military counselor and saint moved their bodies quietly and stood on the left and right sides behind Qin Weibai. In the whistling wind, their bodies seemed to gradually twist and eventually became blurred, like two shadows standing behind Qin Weibai. Qin Weibai's mood seemed to be still agitated. Looking at the sparkling sea under the moonlight, she was silent for 5 or 6 minutes before she turned around and said calmly, "If you come a little later, we don't have to talk about our cooperation." Cold, straightforward and direct. Black Pupil, who was standing behind Wang Xiaoyao, raised her eyebrows. Her dark pupils looked even more terrifying in the slightly strange environment. She forced herself to endure the sudden anger in her heart, took a deep breath, and remained silent. Obviously, there was no room for her to speak in this meeting tonight. Very few people knew about this meeting tonight, and even fewer people could understand the specific meaning of this meeting. Wang Xiaoyao came to see Qin Weibai, which was equivalent to directly contacting the will of Samsara Palace. But Samsara Palace directly contacting Wang Xiaoyao. And only Wang Xiaoyao. Cooperation. Wang Xiaoyao didn't care about the impoliteness in Qin Weibai's tone. His face was a little pale, with obvious hesitation and struggle, and he muttered to himself. He smiled bitterly and said, "Little Bai, do you know that I would rather not have such a cooperation?" "I'm sorry." Qin Weibai was silent for a while, reached out to tidy up her hair that was blown by the wind, and said blandly, "I don't know." Her tone was calm, but there was no emotion in it. Between the lines, there was a sense of alienation that kept people thousands of miles away. This was an attitude that was enough to make any man feel frustrated and even desperate. But it was also an attitude that Wang Xiaoyao was used to. As the younger brother of the Sword Emperor of Jianghu State, Wang Xiaoyao's noble identity was self-evident. With his identity, he had pursued a woman for several years, but there was no scandal. This could fully explain how indifferent the woman behind this obsessive unrequited love was. "Yeah, you don't know," Wang Xiaoyao muttered to himself, and his eyes became more and more gloomy. If he hadn't really fallen in love with the woman in front of him, how wonderful would the meeting tonight be? The word love turned all the plans into contradictions and entanglements. It made him want to retreat when he could only move forward. Was it all worth it? Wang Xiaoyao was in a trance. Qin Weibai's clear voice continued to ring. "I don't need to know. But I can roughly understand." "You don't understand." Wang Xiaoyao shook his head subconsciously. For hundreds of years, the Wang family of Beihai has been the greatest family in the dark world. "Do you know why?" Qin Weibai suddenly asked. As soon as these words came out, not only Wang Xiaoyao, but also Black Pupil, and even Saint and military counselor were obviously stunned. "Of course I know." In an instant, the contradiction in Wang Xiaoyao's eyes disappeared. He stared at Qin Weibai in front of him, opened his mouth, but could not continue to speak. "I also know." Qin Weibai's expression was still indifferent, faintly perfect, but the brilliance in her eyes was getting brighter. "So, I still understand. This has something to do with our cooperation, but it also has nothing to do with it, right?" Wang Xiaoyao was silent. "How are the preparations going?" Qin Weibai turned around again, but her eyes were no longer looking at the sea. Instead, she stood at the highest point, quietly observing the small village shrouded in moonlight a few kilometers away. "I have got the half-style shadow formula from Li Tianlan." Wang Xiaoyao shook his head absent-mindedly. "It will take some time." Your plan needs time and opportunity. Tianlan may be the opportunity you have always wanted. Qin Weibai nodded and said. Wang Xiaoyao clenched his fists, feeling a little uneasy and irritated. With a wry smile, he took out a cigarette and lit it. He took a deep breath and said, "What do you need me to do?" Tonight's meeting was actually simple but not simple. He cooperated with Samsara, so he needed Qin Weibai's promise, and Qin Weibai needed his sincerity. It could be regarded as taking what they needed. But she asked him to meet here. Wang Xiaoyao looked around. The sea, the beach, the cliff, the lights in the distance. He couldn't figure out how to express his sincerity here. This kind of sincerity, which was similar to a pledge of allegiance, could not be shown by doing something casually when standing at the height of him and Samsara. I want you to help me kill a young man. Qin Weibai looked at the quiet village in the distance and said seriously. Okay. Wang Xiaoyao was a little surprised. It seemed too simple to just kill a person. He nodded and said, I'll let Black Pupil do it. Kill who? Where? What I mean is, I want you to help me kill a young man. Right here. Very calmly, Qin Weibai repeated the sentence again. Wang Xiaoyao's eyes narrowed slightly. Vaguely, he could feel that the sincerity he wanted to express did not seem to be so simple, and the key to the sincerity was the young man Qin Weibai wanted him to kill. You want me to do it myself? Kill who? Wang Xiaoyao asked. A real young heavenly son. Black Pupil is no match for him. Qin Weibai said softly without batting an eyelid. The amount of information contained in this seemingly light sentence could be described as stormy waves. No matter how calm Wang Xiaoyao was, he couldn't help but change his face. A young heavenly son that Black Pupil was no match for? How young was he? There seemed to be only a few such characters in the entire dark world, and they were basically the kind of young people who were about 30 years old and not young. As for the younger ones, Wang Xianxia, who was 23 years old and only a few months away from creating a new record, had now reached the thunder-shocking realm. Wang Xianxia, who had wind and thunder veins and top-notch inheritance and amazing talent, could defeat most experts at the peak of the thunder-shocking realm. But in the face of Black Pupil, who was infinitely close to the half-step invincible realm, he still didn't have much confidence. A young heavenly son that even Black Pupil was no match for? Wang Xiangxiao, Li Tianlan, Gu Hanzhan. These three names first came to Wang Xiaoyao's mind. It was naturally impossible for Wang Xiangxiao. Qin Weibai would not ask him to kill his own nephew unless she was crazy. It was even more impossible for Li Tianlan. Gu Hanzhan was definitely no match for Black Pupil. In East Island, Mai Shiranui, the young palace master of Liuhua Palace, was amazing enough, but compared with Black Pupil, she was much worse. Crown Prince Rend could no longer be regarded as a young man. As for other forces, they naturally had their own young experts, but most of them were protected. At least in East Island, where the general situation was unclear, the probability of their appearance was very small. In this way, who did Qin Weibai want to kill? And she wanted him to do it himself. Wang Xiaoyao was very clear that at least in the information of the major forces, his combat capability was far inferior to Black Pupil's. Wang Xiaoyao was an expert. In Zhongzhou State, he could be as famous as Bai Yuming, which was enough to show his extraordinary talent. But Bai Yuming was now only in the stabilization phase of the thunder-shocking realm, which was nearly 2 small realms lower than Black Pupil. The difference between the two was obvious. But now Qin Weibai's meaning was already very sure that Wang Xiaoyao's strength was still above Black Pupil's. Wang Xiaoyao's eyes flickered. Qin Weibai's short sentence contained at least 3 meanings. She knew that he was hiding his strength. East Island now had an unknown young heavenly son. And behind the young heavenly son, there must be an unknown force. Before he came to East Island, he knew that the situation in East Island was complicated. But only when he really came here could he really understand how complicated this chaotic situation was because of the general trend. Who is he? Where is he? Wang Xiaoyao calmed himself down and asked. He's here. Qin Weibai said blandly. If you come a little later, you may miss it. Who is he? Wang Xiaoyao still insisted on this question. Qin Weibai fell silent, making it clear that she did not intend to tell him anything else. Little Bai. Wang Xiaoyao hesitated for a moment and finally said, What do you want to do? There was something wrong with the two of them meeting here, But the most wrong thing was Qin Weibai. It was really too strange for her to show up here. At least Wang Xiaoyao couldn't figure it out. Both of them had their own secrets. But now it seemed that Qin Weibai had known about his plan, but he knew nothing about Qin Weibai's purpose. This feeling made Wang Xiaoyao instinctively feel a little uneasy. I don't want to do anything big. Qin Weibai said blandly, everything I'm doing now is just to change my fate. Wang Xiaoyao stopped talking. In Qin Weibai's ambiguous answer, he clearly felt the danger, and even felt trouble. If everything was related to himself, he would agree without hesitation. He didn't even need any cooperation, just because this was Qin Weibai's request. But behind a young heavenly son, there might be too many things, and it might also be related to the entire Wang family of Beihai. He had to be cautious about such cooperation. And from the beginning, Wang Xiaoyao's attitude toward this cooperation and Qin Weibai was a little vague. So, what if I don't do it? Our cooperation is cancelled. Wang Xiaoyao was silent for a moment and suddenly said. Qin Weibai stood motionless, as if she didn't hear Wang Xiaoyao's words. She just stood there without saying a word. The atmosphere on the cliff suddenly froze. Time passed slowly, and Qin Weibai didn't mean to speak. But saint and military counselor standing on both sides behind her gradually became clear and finally blurred. But this time the blurriness was not to deliberately hide their existence. In an instant, the cliff was covered by an endless amount of sharp sword intent. Saint's figure had completely disappeared, and the whole cliff became a world of swords. The sword intent surged and grew endlessly. Military counselor's figure also began to blur. In the sword intent, he seemed to have become a black hole, suppressing and crazily devouring everything around him. So, I have no choice, right? Wang Xiaoyao laughed at himself and looked at Qin Weibai. Yes. Qin Weibai's tone was indifferent, with a high and mighty reservation. If the target dies, you and I cooperate. Or if the target dies, you also die. So many choices. Wang Xiaoyao nodded and looked along Qin Weibai's line of sight. His eyes also fell on the village a few kilometers away. He frowned slightly and said, Where is he? There. Qin Weibai pointed and said slowly, He's coming. Looking in the direction of Qin Weibai's finger, Wang Xiaoyao could vaguely see a figure walking slowly from the village at the end of his sight. Because of the distance, Wang Xiaoyao could only recognize that it was a figure. Kill him. Qin Weibai said, You and I cooperate. Wang Xiaoyao nodded in silence and narrowed his eyes slightly. The sea breeze blew past with a fishy and salty smell. The cold air pervaded the air, carrying with it a hidden killing intent. As dawn approached, the bright moon slowly fell from the sky. The moonlight gradually dissipated. The sun had not yet risen. The figure that walked out of the village was alone, silently walking in the darkest hour of the day. There was no dawn. Chapter 204. 11,000-word chapter. The sea breeze stopped. The sound of the tide receded. The thick night gradually covered the receding moonlight. In the darkest night before dawn, the whole world seemed to return to the most oppressive silence. The last ray of moonlight sprinkled on the surface of the sea. The blue waves slowly undulated, and the clear and crystalline waves brought along a surging cold radiance, illuminating the entire beach in a misty haze. In the dim light, the figure on the beach seemed to be strolling along with the cool breeze, neither fast nor slow. The light flowed in Black Pupil's dark pupils. She quietly glanced at it, and her face suddenly changed slightly, with an unconcealable surprise. As the moonlight receded, the visibility under the curtain of night had been reduced to the minimum. However, that person was at the extreme end of the line of sight, still out of everyone's observation range. So until now, no one had been able to see who the young heavenly son that Qin Weibai had mentioned was. But Black Pupil was different. Her dark eyes, which had almost no white, looked creepy, but she was gifted. From childhood to adulthood, her sight range and visibility were much stronger than others. Because of this visual advantage, Black Pupil became one of the most valuable talents in the Wang family of Beihai. In terms of strength, Black Pupil, who was infinitely close to the half-step invincible realm and still had room for improvement, was enough to make no one dare to look down on her. And because of her visual advantage, she was also one of the most terrible snipers in the Wang family of Beihai. Therefore, under the circumstance that no one could see clearly in the distance, through the dark night, only Kurome could clearly see the beach in the distance and the figures in the distance. Black pupils contracted obviously, and her eyes became more and more focused. In her sight, the so-called young heavenly son was more than young. He was completely a teenager. At a distance of nearly 300 meters, Black Pupil could clearly see the figure and appearance of the other party under the focus of her eyes. In her sight, it was a face that was not only young but also childish. 16 years old? 17 years old? Or 18 years old? He walked on the beach with a calm face, wearing the junior high school uniform of East Island, carrying a school bag, and seemed to be on his way to school. For a moment, Black Pupil only felt extremely absurd. It was absurd to go to school so early. However, it was equally absurd for Qin Weibai, the second in command of the Samsara Palace, to kill a junior high school student. In such an important cooperation between Wang Xiaoyao and Samsara, it was absurd for him to sacrifice the life of such a child as a pledge of allegiance. It was ridiculous for Qin Weibai to say that she was no match for this child. Kurome stood there a little sluggishly and forgot to speak for a while. The young man on the beach was getting closer, and the others could see him clearly. Is that him? Wang Xiaoyao finally saw the teenager on the coast clearly. His eyes widened, and he looked at Qin Weibai in astonishment, with undisguised suspicion. Not only Wang Xiaoyao, but even the deeply hidden aura of saint and military counselor also fluctuated slightly. Obviously, they were also a little incredulous. This was a young man who still looked childish. He had an average height and appearance, but he looked very clean. Be it his clothes or face, they were all very clean. But other than that, there seemed to be nothing else worth paying attention to. The deep night, the boundless sea. In the huge environment, the thin and small figure walked quietly. It was calm, but there was a hint of loneliness. Qin Weibai's bright and condensed eyes were still clear, but there was a little trance in them. At this moment, she thought of Li Tianlan. The man who had been destined in her destiny, a few years ago, many years ago, was he also like the young man in front of her, walking alone and calmly in the vast mountain forest? How is this person? Qin Weibai was silent for a while and suddenly asked. Her face was calm and perfect, but her heart was always surging violently. Ordinary. Wang Xiaoyao shook his head and glanced at Qin Weibai beside him. Is it possible that you found the wrong person? Qin Weibai raised the corner of her mouth with a sneer, indescribably arrogant and cold. She stared at the young man's eyebrows and eyes at the foot of the mountain seriously. Perhaps it was because of the first impression. At this time, the other person's eyebrows and eyes were so clear and even a little dazzling. I can't see clearly, Saint suddenly said. The sharp sword intent hovering around him had completely become dormant. His calm voice seemed to be faintly hesitant. I can't see clearly either. It's very strange. Can't see clearly? Can't see clearly? Wang Xiaoyao frowned and turned his eyes again to the young man who might die in his hands. The young man by the sea was getting closer and closer. At a distance of tens of meters, they could almost see every expression on his face. Ordinary, calm, and dull. The young man seemed to be thinking about something and looked a little lost in thought. It's very strange. Military counselor's voice sounded in his ear, with a trace of unexplainable doubt. He looks too ordinary. So ordinary that it's a little fake? No, this feeling is very strange. Real and unreal. Qin Weibai said softly without batting an eyelid. Wang Xiaoyao, who had been silently observing the young man, suddenly trembled, and his pupils suddenly contracted. He finally found the young man's abnormality. The night was spreading. The waves were undulating. The young man in front of him walked unhurriedly on the beach, but his every move brought a clear and almost strange sense of reality. Everything about him seemed to be placed in front of them and could be seen through at a glance. But if they observed carefully, they would find that the so-called seeing through was no different from not seeing at all. He was very real, but his whole person did not have any emotion or temperament. Between the real and the unreal, there was no disguise, no self, only a very real emptiness. It was like a mass of air. He clearly saw it, but it seemed that he didn't see it. It was the first time that Wang Xiaoyao had felt this strange feeling. For a moment, all the hair on his body even stood up, and he even felt that he had seen a ghost. Young heavenly son? Young heavenly son? Qin Weibai's evaluation suddenly became very heavy in his heart. His face was solemn and he slowly said, "This person is not simple. Who the hell is he?" Such a person made him instinctively feel strange and dangerous, even frightened. It was almost an intuition. On the surface, Wang Xiaoyao's strength was at the stabilization phase of the Thundershocking realm, but he was already in his early 30s, and his actual strength had already reached the half-step invincible realm. Although he hadn't reached the level of saint and military counselor yet, he didn't have to be afraid of a young man. What he worried and even feared was the future of the young man in front of him. If he was really a young heavenly son, he would definitely be a figure that no one dared to ignore in the dark world in the future. Qin Weibai didn't speak, just quietly watched the young man getting closer and closer. The soft wind blew her clothes. In a trance, this extraordinary woman who was regarded as a goddess by countless people in the dark world became more and more ethereal and dreamy. No one knew what the young man in front of him meant to the dark world, to East Island, and to the upcoming Battle of Chongdao. Military counselor didn't know. Neither did Saint. If Li Tianlan was the target that Qin Weibai had to protect at all costs in the Battle of Chongdao, the young man in front of him was the target that she would kill at all costs. The two seemed to be unrelated, but were they really? The memories rang clearly with the sound of the tide, and then turned into a huge wave, crazily attacking all her reason. In fact, it had nothing to do with the poison of coldness and the poison of heat, and it had nothing to do with the deal between Samsara and that mysterious force. Even if there was nothing, she had to kill the young man in front of her. It was just that after the two kinds of strange poisons, her mentality had completely changed. Should I do it now? Wang Xiaoyao hesitated and asked. He still didn't know the strength of the young man in front of him, but the more he observed, the more urgent he felt. There seemed to be an intuition that reminded him of the threat that the young man in front of him posed to him, so he couldn't wait to make a move. He took a step forward, and a trace of killing intent flashed in his eyes. This killing intent suppressed infinite sharpness, but it was very weak, so weak that it was almost imperceptible. But almost at the same time, the young man, who was walking forward silently and seemed to be distracted, suddenly stopped. They were dozens of meters apart, separated by the darkest night. The young man instantly raised his head and looked at the cliff. All of a sudden, Wang Xiaoyao only felt that he saw two stars. It was a pair of eyes that suddenly condensed all the brilliance, clear and calm with a trace of playfulness. The afterglow of the moon seemed to concentrate on him all at once, making him look more real and more illusory. "Who's there?" He slowly opened his mouth, and his soft voice carried the hoarseness of a young boy's voice changing period. It was as gentle as the night wind blowing in the ear. Such a keen perception was simply incredible. Although the two sides were only dozens of meters apart, that was only a horizontal distance. One was above and the other was below, and there was a cliff rising from the ground. At such a distance, the other party could instantly lock their position with a trace of killing intent. It was simply... Wang Xiaoyao's eyes had completely condensed, and the fierce killing intent flashed in his pupils. He took another step forward and was about to jump off the cliff. "Saint!" Qin Weibai suddenly spoke softly. Saint silently took a step forward. "You go." Qin Weibai said faintly, "Make it quick." Wang Xiaoyao was stunned, and then he understood. Even if Qin Weibai wanted him to kill the teenager below, she didn't want him to do it now. It seemed that Qin Weibai just wanted him to end the teenager's life instead of fighting with him in person. He raised his eyebrows and didn't say anything. Obviously, the teenager below had secrets, and Qin Weibai didn't seem to want to expose these secrets, so she asked Saint to do it. At this moment, Wang Xiaoyao's heart was full of strange feelings. In the current situation of East Island, who on earth was this teenager that Qin Weibai secretly came to Jianghu to kill? What impact could it have on the current situation? In recent years, Wang Xiaoyao had learned too much about this woman who made him unable to extricate himself from the first time he met her. He could be sure that if the teenager below was an insignificant person who had nothing to do with the general trend, even if he was a young heavenly son, Qin Weibai wouldn't be in a hurry to kill such a person. "Okay." Saint responded faintly, took a step forward, and rushed off the cliff without hesitation. His body wrapped in a black cloak fell at a high speed, and the sword energy, like a flash flood, stirred the night and rushed directly to the teenager by the beach. The dull thunder suddenly rolled across the sky, and the thunder fell. The sword energy tore the night, and the hundreds of meters of the night sky was instantly dyed into a strange blue curtain by the sword energy. The curtain was like lightning, with a fierce killing intent that could destroy everything. The sword energy was majestic and mighty. In an instant, the teenager who had stood quietly by the sea completely changed. His figure became clearer under the blue light curtain, but his momentum became more and more illusory. Under the sharp light of the mighty sword energy, the teenager had a vague feeling that he was almost dissipating between heaven and earth. Only his eyes were still bright and clear. They passed through the light curtain made of sword energy, through the night, and directly shot to the cliff. It was clear and calm, but it was filled with a kind of suppressed ferocity. Saint's body had landed. In front of him, the light curtain made of sword energy was still expanding, and almost in the blink of an eye, it completely enveloped the teenager. The sword chi was wreaking havoc in the air, and the sand on the beach was shot up into the sky by the sword chi, flying hundreds of meters into the sky. Countless dark blue electric arcs danced wildly, and the whole battlefield instantly turned into a strange and dazzling world. In the blurred light and shadow, the pair of clear but ferocious eyes became brighter. The teenager didn't move, and he didn't take out any weapon. He just threw away the school bag in his hand and put his hands together. At the moment when the sword energy was about to fall, the teenager's hands suddenly made a complicated and strange emblematic gesture. This was a unique skill that had never appeared in the dark world. It was strange. It was unknown. Formless seal. Heaven and earth were formless, and all living beings were formless. The sword energy, which was as dense as a curtain, rushed past the teenager almost violently. The teenager's body seemed to flicker very slightly. The next second, his extremely thin body had appeared directly in front of Saint. Fast. He was as fast as a ghost. Wang Xiaoyao, who had been staring at all this, didn't even see how he avoided the violent sword energy for a while. The teenager's hands were still put together, his fingers changed, and a new emblematic gesture was suddenly formed again. The temperature in the air plummeted. The midsummer suddenly turned into cold winter, and the world seemed to become absolutely indifferent. Crack! In the clear sound, the high sky above suddenly condensed into a layer of ice. The ice spread wildly and almost instantly spread to a range of hundreds of meters. The emblematic gesture in the teenager's hands was completely formed. Boom! The ice of hundreds of meters shook violently, and then completely shattered. Countless sharp pieces of ice, like spears, kept falling from the sky with a sharp whistle. Heartless seal. The soft wind, the dark night, and the cold moon. Everything disappeared in an instant, and there was only the violent killing intent and extreme indifference left on the whole battlefield. Swish! Without any hesitation, Saint pulled out the long sword behind him at the first time. The boss said to finish the battle as soon as possible, so from the beginning, he went all out. The light on the bright sword edge jumped, and a touch of dangerous blue condensed to the extreme immediately filled the sword edge. The teenager and Saint were already very close. When the sword edge was raised, the tip of the sword almost touched the teenager's chest. The blue edge silently cut through the teenager's school uniform, and the teenager's figure had already soared into the sky. What moved with his body was still the emblematic gesture. His emblematic gesture had become more and more complicated, and the fast emblematic gesture had brought out a large number of clear shadows. It went up. It kept going up. Saint raised his sword and looked up. The teenager's figure had appeared in the air at a height of nearly 100 meters. The emblematic gesture was completely condensed. Infinite seal. Boom. There was a sudden burst of thunder at the highest point of the sky. A blue and purple light spot suddenly appeared high in the sky and fell straight down from the sky. The light spot kept getting bigger, and in the blink of an eye, it became a thick and almost terrifying lightning, crossing the sky and the earth. Thunder-shocking realm. Except for Qin Wei Bai. Everyone's face changed completely. This was not even the most basic thunder-shocking realm, but an expert who was infinitely close to the peak of the thunder-shocking realm. A teenager in the thunder-shocking realm? How could this be possible? How on earth could his body bear the power of the thunder-shocking realm? The look in Saint's eyes also changed. He had already overestimated the teenager in the sky, but he did not expect that the other party was actually close to the peak of the thunder-shocking realm. When Qin Wei Bai said that Black Pupil was no match for him, Saint did not think much about it. He thought that the other party was at most at the peak of the fire-flaming realm, or similar to the state of Li Tianlan in the half-step thunder-shocking realm. If he was a real heavenly son, that kind of strength was enough to barely defeat Black Pupil. Before the battle, he never thought that a teenager in his teens would have the strength infinitely close to the peak of the thunder-shocking realm. What did a heavenly son close to the peak of the thunder-shocking realm mean? It meant that the other party was enough to pose an absolutely fatal threat to him. On the cliff, military counselor subconsciously took a step forward. Wang Xiaoyao and Black Pupil's killing intent was no longer concealed. Especially Wang Xiaoyao, his whole body was cold, and for the first time, he felt bone-chilling fear. A 10-year-old expert at the peak of the thunder-shocking realm, not to mention how his body could bear this power, this talent was enough to make everyone's scalp numb. At this age, he had reached this realm. How old could he be when he entered the invincible realm? 25 years old? 28 years old? With such talent, he seemed to be stronger than Wang Xiangxiao and Li Tianlan. If he grew up, he would be a huge threat to everyone. Everyone! Boom! The violent thunder came down from above, and the huge lightning seemed to fall from the end of the sky. The area with a radius of tens of meters was completely shrouded by this lightning that had expanded to the limit. Looking from above, this was completely a beam of light that broke through the confinement of heaven and earth, with the power to destroy everything. This was the real power of heaven and earth. The teenager's hands still maintained the gesture, and his expression was cold. At this moment, he was floating in the air, and his whole body was surrounded by lightning. He was as majestic as a god. The huge lightning fell from the sky and shrouded the surroundings. There was no way to avoid it. In the center of the lightning, Saint suddenly straightened his body, raised his arm and shook his sword. There was a sudden roar in the center of the lightning, and the ordinary long sword in Saint's hand was directly shattered. With him as the center, the air within hundreds of meters suddenly twisted and rotated crazily. Countless icicles falling from the sky instantly turned into powder. Saint's body did not move, but a storm hundreds of meters high rose around him. The storm changed from twisting to a deep blue. Endless thunder and lightning roared in the storm, and the whole space seemed to be frozen. The lightning fell from above. The storm rose from the ground. Wind and thunder gathered. The fierce whistling sound echoed around with a sharp sound that almost pierced people's eardrums. A large amount of sand was rolled into the air, and the trees and grass were completely smashed in the expanding airwaves. The impact of the wind and thunder hit everything around, and the whole cliff was shaking violently. Military counselor was calm. The airflow in front of him was twisted, and it firmly protected Qin Weibai. The desperate power below kept colliding, and the wind and thunder roared. But under the protection of military counselor, Qin Weibai's hair did not even flutter. The teenager's figure kept floating with the wind, and it seemed more strange and empty. He made a gesture with both hands. The air seemed to be completely torn apart, and the violent seaside seemed to have fallen from the cold winter to the hell. The cold wind rolled up the sand and whistled up. The storm around Saint was circling, but the whole space turned into deep blue with the teenager's gesture. In an instant, the last gesture in the teenager's hands was formed. The storm around Saint suddenly stagnated. Almost at the same time, a majestic divine light that could not be looked at directly suddenly flashed in Qin Weibai's bright eyes. The dead spirit seal. The battlefield suddenly quieted down. As if a dull wind was blowing slowly, with extreme coldness and death aura, the whole deep blue space suddenly burst into pieces. Endless lightning swept everything in an instant, and the whole sea became a world full of lightning. The storm around Saint was torn into pieces, and even the sword energy almost disappeared. The teenager who had been making gestures looked slightly pale, and he finally stopped for a while. Saint's figure, which had rushed into the air, landed again. He raised his head and looked at the teenager in the air quietly. But under the cover of the cloak, the red blood kept flowing down the corner of his mouth, as if it would never stop. What kind of unique skill is this? Wang Xiaoyao kept taking several deep breaths, and then he said with some difficulty. There were countless unique skills in the dark world, but some of them were not powerful, just because the people who used them were different so they could shock the world. Some unique skills were extraordinary, and in the hands of experts, they were more fierce and domineering. Only a few unique skills shocked the world, and they belonged to the top inheritance. In the hands of experts, their power was simply the best in the generation. For example, The 6 Paths of Reincarnation Sword of the Wang family of Beihai. For example, the 24 Moves of Sword of the Li family. For example, the 10 Skills of True Martial Arts of Kunlun City. He had never heard of this set of gestures of the teenager in front of him, but judging from its power, it was so domineering. He had never heard of such an inheritance before, and it was unimaginable. He hurt Saint with a strength less than the peak of the thunder-shocking realm. Even if he was a young heavenly son, it was enough to shock people. Who was Saint? The first supermaster of Samsara, one of the strongest experts under the invincible realm. In the dark world, he could be as famous as Gong Sun Qi, the azure dragon of Jianghu state, Tribulation, the king of shadow, and Wei Kunlun, the nirvana swordmaster of Jianghu state. He belonged to the top superior of the half-step invincible realm, and he had even vaguely broken through the limit of the half-step invincible realm, but he had not really reached the invincible realm. Wang Xiaoyao did not deny the teenager's talent, but without the top inheritance of martial arts, it was impossible for him to do this. I heard my sister talk about it. Qin Weibai sighed softly. This is the immortality seal. Wang Xiaoyao was stunned. He had never heard of this name. The master of Samsara Palace mentioned it? He looked at Qin Weibai and asked subconsciously, what is the immortality seal? I don't know martial arts, so I can't tell the principle. It should be imitating heaven and earth, integrating heaven and earth. It belongs to the category of momentum, pure momentum. Qin Weibai shook her head. The 6 Paths of Reincarnation of the Wang family of Beihai was the combination of strength and intent. It broke out in an instant and sublimated to the extreme. The 24 Moves of Sword of the Li family was the combination of intent and momentum. It broke everything and was unparalleled in the world. But the immortality seal in front of him was just seeking momentum. Pure momentum. They were different paths of martial arts, and it was hard to tell which was better. When they reached the extreme, they all had the power of the generation. Wang Xiaoyao's face was a little pale. He had never heard of the immortality seal. The strength of the person who created this unique skill was simply unimaginable. Sure enough, it was not so easy to cooperate with Qin Weibai. He even felt that he had caused a huge trouble. What else do you know about the immortality seal? Wang Xiaoyao was silent for a moment and looked at Qin Weibai seriously. I don't know much. I'm not very interested in martial arts. I just heard it from my sister casually. The immortality seal should have 12 seals and 3 comprehensive moves. I don't know the rest. Qin Weibai's tone was cold. Then, Wang Xiaoyao looked at the teenager floating in the air, wanting to say something but stopping on second thought. If it's him, he can at most use 9 styles, and there's also a comprehensive style. That's the limit. Qin Weibai seemed to know what he wanted to ask. She said indifferently, it's already the 4th move. The conversation between the two finally attracted the teenager's attention. In the silence, the teenager's body floating in the air suddenly floated up again. The lightning almost completely wrapped his whole body, making him look like a thunder god who controlled thunder and lightning, fierce and indifferent. In the lightning, the teenager's height was already as high as the cliff. They looked at each other. The teenager's indifferent eyes suddenly flashed a trace of fierce killing intent. He sneered and said, Qin Weibai? Wang Xiaoyao? What a big battle. Is the one down there the military counselor? Or a saint? Have you thought about the consequences when you deal with me? It was standard, but it was standard and a little weird Chinese. Do you know me? Wang Xiaoyao frowned tightly. He smelled the conspiracy more and more clearly, but he had no way to escape tonight. If the Wang family of Beihai has a disaster in the future, it's all because of tonight. The teenager, who had taken off all the disguises, said in a cold tone. His momentum suddenly soared. Just when everyone thought he was going to attack the cliff, his figure flashed away from the battlefield in an instant. His cold sneer came from the air. You don't deserve to kill me. Go back and wait for our revenge. Wang Xiaoyao's expression suddenly changed. He subconsciously wanted to intercept him, but the teenager's figure had flashed continuously. In the blink of an eye, he had reached the seaside. He couldn't catch up with this kind of speed at all. If he escapes tonight... Wang Xiaoyao's heart suddenly sank. At the bottom of the cliff, a ferocious roar suddenly rang out. Saint didn't hesitate and went straight to the teenager who had reached the seaside. The teenager sneered. His feet landed on the sea and he suddenly turned around. There was a sudden change when he was unprepared. The seawater under the teenager's feet suddenly exploded, and countless splashes surged. The teenager's fleeing figure hit the splashes, but his whole body didn't move forward. Instead, he instantly retreated dozens of meters. Bomb! The teenager was shocked and angry, but more confused. He couldn't tell whether the explosion was a bomb or not. If it was a bomb, how could the other party bury it here in advance? Was it a coincidence? Everything happened in the blink of an eye. But the distance of dozens of meters was enough for Saint to get close to him again. The teenager's indifferent face suddenly changed. He opened his mouth and roared, "This is..." Boom! The huge roar of sword energy suddenly smashed down, drowning out all the teenager's voice. Saint raised his arms high, and the sword energy all over his body condensed crazily. A giant sword with a length of hundreds of meters appeared above his head. Saint clenched his hands and suddenly chopped down. The sword energy that almost split heaven and earth roared wildly and smashed down. A trace of ferocity flashed in the teenager's eyes, and he subconsciously dodged to the right. Boom! The giant sword fell on the sea, and hundreds of meters of seawater were split open. The huge impact made the teenager's body suddenly lose balance, and he directly spat out a mouthful of blood. No one could see what happened at that moment, and no one knew why the teenager's figure, which could have gone far, retreated. But it didn't matter at all. Wang Xiaoyao's eyes were indifferent. As soon as Saint caught up with the teenager, he had already left the cliff and rushed to the seaside at full speed. Saint's figure was close to the teenager in an instant. He didn't have a sword in his hand, but there were hundreds and thousands of blue sword shadows whistling around him. One after another, the long swords kept exploding, bringing with them a destructive power. The whole place shook violently in the fierce collisions. Wang Xiaoyao's figure quickly approached the seaside. If the teenager ran away, the entire Wang family of Beihai would provoke a big enemy in the future. The Wang family of Beihai was not afraid of trouble, but no one wanted to trouble themselves. So this time, he didn't hide his strength at all. In the roar of thunder and seawater, his body drove the electric light straight into the battlefield. They were dozens of meters apart. Wang Xiaoyao opened his hands, and a giant sword dozens of meters long suddenly condensed in his hands. The giant sword was heavy and sharp, and with an almost unstoppable sharpness, it turned in Wang Xiaoyao's hands. Wang Xiaoyao held his palm and swept the sword. The endless seawater suddenly exploded, and the giant sword, like opening the sky, swept with abundant and irresistible sword intent. Infinite killing intent suddenly broke out on the sea. 6 paths of reincarnation. Sword of King path. There was finally a trace of undisguised eagerness in the teenager's indifferent eyes, and he suddenly said, "I am." Boom! Thousands of long swords sprang out of the water again, and the roar was completely intended to cover up the teenager's words. Countless long swords condensed from seawater flashed with thunder and rushed to the teenager's back. Saint was silent, and he made up his mind not to let the teenager say a word. "You!" The teenager's eyes suddenly stood up. Saint's sword energy and Wang Xiaoyao's sword intent almost shrouded him at the same time. The teenager seemed to know that he couldn't be kind today, and he went completely crazy. Thunder and lightning were blooming all over his body. In the face of the siege of Saint and Wang Xiaoyao, he didn't retreat at all, but chose to fight desperately. "All of you go to hell!" The teenager roared with all his strength, and the handprint of his hands changed again. In the thunder and lightning, a large area of seawater suddenly surged and shook. The waves turned over, and countless seawater instantly rose. Sea seal. In the roar that seemed to destroy the world, countless seawater violently rushed to the sky. For a moment, the world was turning over. The sea turned into a mountain and the sky. The originally calm sea instantly set off a huge wave as high as 100 feet. The huge waves kept rising and almost covered the sky. In the almost suffocating scene, the huge wave surged down with irresistible force. The teenager's expression was cold. At this moment, his every move had a kind of dazzling style, and the momentum was so strong that it could almost split the sky. The huge waves were like landslides. Wang Xiaoyao's giant sword and Saint's thunder and lightning were instantly submerged by the huge waves. Their bodies went up against the current in the huge waves, shaking constantly. The huge wave suppressed the thunder and the giant soared and fell on the coast. The whole coastline seemed to be shaking, and the place where the huge waves hit directly left a deep pit with a length of hundreds of meters. The teenager, who had been completely crazy, did not stop and made another handprint. Above the sea, his body suddenly shot straight into the sky. Star River Seal. Instantly, all the glimmers in the heavens and the earth seemed to have converged onto the young man. The young man was like a young god that had descended to the mortal world, and his entire body was covered in a cold and lethal light that seemed like a boundless and boundless river of stars. Saint and Wang Xiaoyao raised their hands instinctively. High in the sky, the teenager, whose every move seemed to be able to destroy the world, suddenly swooped down with endless light. Pseudo-domain. Wang Xiaoyao suddenly let out a scream. The teenager's swooping body was close to Saint and Wang Xiaoyao, with the whole galaxy and the whole sky. The figures of Saint and Wang Xiaoyao fell into the deep sea with the teenager in an instant. The monstrous thunder and lightning continued to spread on the sea, and the dark blue kept rising and spreading on the sea. The whole sea began to spin wildly with the teenager as the center. Attack first. Still attack first. The teenager, who had made up his mind, had a great courage to ignore life and death. The moment the three fell into the sea, a new handprint was formed again. Samsara Seal. The dark blue sea suddenly turned into a huge whirlpool that could swallow everything. Saint and Wang Xiaoyao, who had no time to adjust, were constantly spinning with the whirlpool, and their bodies were almost completely out of balance. This was not a pseudo-domain, but it could make the body lose control. Wasn't it a pseudo-domain in another sense? Endless thunder and lightning continued to condense in the whirlpool, and one after another kept hitting Wang Xiaoyao. Wang Xiaoyao's body shook violently, and his strong aura instantly weakened. Saint suddenly snorted coldly. In the fiercely spinning whirlpool, a blazing fire instantly burned on the sea. The thick whirlpool evaporated rapidly, and even a large amount of thunder and lightning began to be completely obliterated. The teenager let out a long roar. His body rose into the air again, and his hands made a handprint. Ling Xiao Seal. The sea calmed down in the turbulence. There was no change in the sky. But the teenager's eyes were blood red. As the handprint was completed, his aura instantly soared. The peak of the thunder-shocking realm. Saint and Wang Xiaoyao were startled. How similar was this handprint to the unique skill of the Wang family of Beihai, against the way of heaven. The teenager finished the handprint, but he did not stop. His face was frighteningly pale, but his movements became more and more determined, with inviolable pride and coldness. The ninth handprint. Divine Punishment Handprint. The light around the teenager suddenly expanded and instantly spread into a halo with a range of hundreds of meters. The handprint was completed. In the roar of thunder, countless thunder and lightning suddenly appeared in the air. 10, 100, 1,000. Within a radius of hundreds of meters, the area covered by the halo instantly became a hell of thunder and lightning. Saint resisted with all his strength, but he was shocked to find that all the thunder and lightning, fire, and even ice within the scope of the halo were all sucked out. All he could rely on was the sword, and only the sword energy. The dense thunder and lightning kept falling from the sky, like the wrath of heaven. Wang Xiaoyao could hardly hold on and coughed up blood. He held on, subconsciously glanced at Saint, and smiled bitterly. Although Saint did his best, he did not use all his unique skills. His so-called full strength was just the power of his realm. But from beginning to end, Saint's sword only had sword energy, not sword intent. It was self-evident what this meant. Among the 12 supermasters of Samsara, the other supermasters might be mysterious, but there were traces to follow. Only military counselor and Saint had no information to search for. The two of them seemed to have appeared out of thin air. It could only be said that the two most mysterious heavenly kings had hidden themselves very well, so well that no one knew who they really were. Sword intent was the easiest clue to guess a person's real origin. But Saint did not use the slightest sword intent from beginning to end. In other words, he did not use any unique skills. If not, he would not be so passive. At this time, did he still want to hide his identity? Wang Xiaoyao vomited blood, and his consciousness gradually faded. The thunder and lightning in the sky finally fell. In the night, the young man's cold and arrogant voice sounded again, with extreme killing intent and undisguised weakness. I'll send you on your way. His hands formed seals again. This time, the seals were obviously much faster than before, but it was also much longer. One by one, the seals were completed quickly. The youth's extremely powerful aura instantly became extremely weak, but the seals were still continuing. Wang Xiaoyao suddenly thought of Qin Weibai's words. His lips moved, and he struggled to say, "Comprehensive style?" Boom! The world seemed to shake suddenly. The young man's gestures had been completed, and endless light gushed out of his body. It was dazzling enough to cover up everything, and sharp enough to stir the whole world. Behind the immortality seal, it turned out to be the edge of the sword. There was no thunder, fire, or ice in the light. There was only wind. It was gentle and soft. It was illusory. The wind that destroyed everything. Comprehensive style. Emptiness and infinity. The world was empty, but the deadly danger was endless. Saint suddenly widened his eyes, as if he couldn't believe it. But he immediately reacted, gave a long roar, and jumped up. His body sank into the light and disappeared completely. No one could see everything clearly. They only felt that the world was surging, and the light completely covered all the pictures. In the young man's unwilling and desperate roar, the dangerous light and sharp edge instantly expanded and burst. The sword intent, which was so complicated that it was extremely difficult to identify, surged and scattered. In the light, the figures of Saint and the young man fell from the sky at the same time. The young man's mouth was full of blood, and there seemed to be some minced flesh of his tongue. In the last sword, Saint was slightly better, but he deliberately crushed the young man's tongue. In the end, it was a lose-lose situation. From beginning to end, Saint didn't let the young man say anything. They didn't even know his name. The young man's body fell to the ground, and his breath was weak, but he looked unusually calm. The battlefield was completely quiet. The sound of light footsteps came through the night. No one knew when Qin Weibai had walked down the cliff and came to the front of the young man. She looked at his eyes calmly. When the young man saw Qin Weibai, his calm face suddenly became excited. He stared at her and struggled to move to Qin Weibai. Although he couldn't speak, everyone could feel the unwillingness and questioning in his eyes. But Qin Weibai's eyes were more complicated. "Do you want to know why I killed you?" Qin Weibai looked at the young man and suddenly asked softly. The young man's struggling body stopped, and he just stared at Qin Weibai's dreamy and perfect face, panting heavily. Because some people seem to have no weakness, but their biggest weakness is responsibility. He is, and so is he. Qin Weibai said calmly, "And I happen to have the least sense of responsibility." The young man's eyes narrowed, and he seemed to be relieved, but then his eyes became cold and mocking. Qin Weibai's eyes gradually became cold, with some inexplicable hatred. The young man's eyes seemed to irritate her. She said coldly, "I know you are not convinced, but I won't give you a chance. Your road to the heavenly sun ends here." The fear in the young man's eyes flashed away. He clenched his teeth and closed his eyes. Qin Weibai turned her head and glanced at Wang Xiaoyao, who was weak but still awake. "Kill him," she whispered. Wang Xiaoyao hesitated, but he still walked over. "I want to see it with my own eyes." Qin Weibai's tone was as light as the wind, but it was mixed with the ice and snow of deep winter. "I want to see you kill him with my own eyes and burn his bones to ashes." Burn his bones to ashes. How deep was his obsession? Wang Xiaoyao's body trembled slightly, and a long sword condensed from lightning took shape in his hand. He hesitated, but finally raised his hand and stabbed the young man's throat with it. The young man's vitality quickly disappeared. Under the lightning, he finally turned into a pile of ashes. The heavenly sun died. Qin Weibai turned and left calmly. The young heavenly sun was born without a name, and died without a name. You're tuning in to the Wisdom Diary YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.